All right, so we can get going then. So welcome everyone. This is our final session on this book, Theory of Intuition, Husserl's Phenomenology. This is Levinas, young Levinas on Husserl. Reading it mostly to understand about Husserl, only secondarily about Levinas. But Husserl can be very challenging just because he's long-winded, very technical into his terms and so forth. And so Levinas is a kind of more approachable introduction to him, although it comes with its own challenges. And this time we're reading chapters 6 and 7 and the conclusion. So that's on ideas, philosophical intuition, and then wrap up. So I want to get people a chance to first tell me about familiarity, what amount of the reading they're able to do. Joe was trying to tell us that before we started recording, so we'll come back to that. And then first reactions to things. So Joe, you were explaining that you had read the conclusion and first 6 pages of chapter 6 or of chapter 7?
Chapter 7, I only devoted the short time to. I spent most of my time because I typically start at the beginning and move through during the 2 weeks that we have.
Yep.
But I fell behind and thought I should at least cover the material. And I was pleased I did because I can see how his ideas came together, even though I didn't follow all of the details through all of the development of Levinas' explanation. Anyway, so it's very good, and I'll bring my questions up later. One term that pops up is he makes distinctions. He starts making these very interesting distinctions, types of intuition and how intuition moves and stuff. And at first I think I was stuck with the word. What does eidetic mean? Right. And then I kept seeing it, but normally I will jump to something like Wikipedia or Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to try to, figure that out before I go farther, but I didn't have time. Wissenschaft. And then I was pleased to realize through his further discussion that he makes an important distinction. I remember in our earlier several months of looking at the different forms of being in philosophers through history, it turns out, certainly at the end, when we're talking about like maybe Schwarz, that existence is accidental. Essence is where the action is, always has been to those guys. And then existence pops up and becomes like the primary thing. And I think that had a lot to do with the English empiricism movement. And here in this book, he mentioned earlier that Locke made a very interesting mistake trying to generalize to well, anyway, we can talk about that when you get to it. But that was the real eye opener.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, the focus on the eidetic is kind of if you can put it this way, a rehabilitation of Platonic thinking about essences, so to speak.
I saw the accusations against him by those who claim he's just Plato in disguise.
But Husserl definitely has his own sort of theory / doctrine of ideas, which is kind of what chapter 6 is about. But in his terms, eidetic means, the idea-like layer of things, so to speak. So if there's a layer of like phenomenological experience of things, there may be a layer of an external reality that you're trying to understand things about that's a transcendent layer. The eidetic is something like constituted by consciousness as true generalities detected in objects, something like that, in objects of thought. So he has his own whole theory about that, but that's the particular layer he's trying to isolate with that term. It's meant to be a term that's referring to reasoning by or about ideas at the level of ideas where the things being transacted with are ideas. The paradigm case of the eidetic level for Husserl would be something like mathematics. So the relation that mathematical ideas about space have to our physical intuitions of space, for example, or to the kind of space we deal with in physics. The geometry analysis level of understanding of space would be the eidetic understanding of space, in the sense that it's something that may look in a certain sense to be abstracted from the empirical, but it has this pure relation of essences, a pure relation of ideas character, right? So it's not the same thing as a purely formal character, because it's not just form in his terms, but you can reason about essences about space independent of trying to verify those propositions with direct experiences of space, and independent of having to have any physical theory about what space is as a transcendent thing, right?
What about
real thing.
a Cartesian type of geometric measurement, but
Yes,
the algebra and the math that is
that would be included in this, right? So the
eidetic or not?
that's eidetic. That's eidetic. That's eidetic,
Okay.
right? So if I'm trying to do a physical experiment to determine the empirical properties of the space in which we happen to be living, I'm not moving on an eidetic level directly. I'm trying to do something else. If I'm just talking about my experience of the orientation I seem to experience in my internal subjective waking consciousness, I'm also not talking about the eidetic level. But if I'm talking because in one case I'm trying to talk about something which is in a sense transcendent empirical, in the other case I'm trying to talk about something which is in a sense hyletic or experiential interior, right? When I'm thinking of the eidetic level, I'm thinking about things like my ideas of space, right? How I reason about space. Things are inside other things. Space is a concept that includes distance. It includes different independent dimensions or orientations, right? Thinking about things that way, you can found a whole mathematics on top of it. That mathematics is not pure logic. It has all kinds of characteristics that aren't coming from just logic, so it's not purely formal in his sense. It's got matter that it's about. It's about space and extended things and relations you find in space, but it's still pure theory in a sense. It's still purely, it's quite divorced from the empirical, right? You're reasoning about pure ideas, right? And you're discovering things which are a priori true about pure ideas. So that's like the paradigm case of an eidetic level, right? Now, what's characteristic about Husserl is he claims that that's way bigger than just mathematics or mathematics related to space. He's going to claim that there's eidetic levels of other things too, right? We can get more into that, but fundamentally, the something like conceptual thinking about a region of being is eidetic thinking. Okay, just his use of the term. It's referring to the word idea, but it's referring to it as this layer of that we, other philosophies might refer to as the conceptual level, and that a Platonist might view as reasoning about the ideas, a nominalist might view as reasoning about abstractions, right? But for him, these things are real and are one of the ways in which consciousness has access to truths about being, right? Okay, but distinct from its access to like an empirical fact of a particular positive science or something like that. Okay, but all of chapter 6 is kind of about his whole theory of those ideas, but I just wanted to react to the puzzling about what he means by eidetic, because it's definitely a term of art for him. And if you haven't like read several of his books, you won't quite know what he's trying to get at with it. You're right that he makes careful distinctions in all these things, and tracking all of them is hard, especially because so many of them are new. But before you go on to more like that, let's get first just things like, were you able to do the reading? Have you read any of this stuff before? Keeping Up or Lost? First reactions to it, anything like that? Let's do Craig first.
So first reaction on completing it, I have to be honest, a bit disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the two areas that stuck out in my disappointment were it seems like Levinas really doesn't ever completely let him off the hook on intellectualism.
Correct.
And so he leaves it hanging there. And there's brief references to future works that he can't talk about because they aren't published yet. And I would have liked to have seen the translator at least give some reference to those future works, but we got left hanging on the question of intellectualism.
So I think it's fair to say. I think it's also fair to say that none of Husserl's later published works changed his basic take on that front, and Levinas's objection to what he views as like the excessive intellectualism or theoretical focus in Husserl would remain a criticism that Levinas would still level at, all of Husserl, finished Husserl, to the extent that he was able to finish his last works. And it's also the place where Levinas is more on the side of his student Heidegger than he is on the side of Husserl, right? From Levinas's point of view, Heidegger starts off from this point of criticism of Husserl, right? That he's going to consider the pragmatic action aspects of life orientation, so to speak, rather than just the purely theoretical. And from Levinas's point of view, at least young Levinas's point of view, that's kind of a correction to a one-sidedness that's there in Husserl, where Husserl is trying to maintain his contact with kind of the logical Carnap kind of tradition and the analytic philosopher kind of tradition in this very theoretical focus. And Heidegger is just saying, no, we can break with that entirely. We don't need to maintain that contact at all. We can go make the practical way more important and the theoretical way less important. And that was sort of a step Husserl wasn't willing to make. Levinas thinks that it was a step that was justified, but in that sense, it's not Husserl later that takes that step. It's Heidegger who takes that step with things like basic problems of phenomenology and being in time. Now Levinas himself will then have his own ways that he later breaks with Heidegger on other things, somewhat related in that criticism, but young Levinas thinks that Heidegger is right on this thing and that Husserl is too narrow-minded on this thing and hasn't seen sort of Heidegger's point yet. And he thinks that it's Heidegger who takes the next step, and Husserl got them started, but the consistent application of Husserlian principles would have downplayed the theoretical and played up the practical more than Husserl did, and Heidegger was the guy to see that. So that's sort of where the theoretical thing, where the criticism of how excessively theoretical Levinas sees Husserl as being goes. Husserl doesn't correct it, but Levinas thinks Heidegger does. Now, partly that's Levinas is already sort of trying to anticipate the next move. He's like not letting you digest Husserl's philosophy alone as a standalone thing without giving you all the criticisms of it, right? He wants to put your interest in it or your acceptance of it in brackets of, well, it was a limited thing, and here's the where we're going next criticism of it, so to speak. And partly that's because he's explaining all these developments for a French audience unfamiliar with them that isn't keeping up, so to speak. And so he doesn't want to present Husserl as the be-all and end-all in phenomenology because there's another step that's already been taken that Levinas is already impressed with by the time he writes this. Right, because this is like 4 years after being in time, and Levinas has already studied that with Heidegger. So he wants to present Levinas as guiding us launch in this direction, but he's sort of preparing people to be impressed with the next step. From Husserl's point of view, if that step isn't as justified as Levinas and Heidegger think it is, then this is a kind of impertinent criticism, right? You haven't established this point yet, and you're just saying afterwards we went somewhere else. That's nice. Could you please understand my philosophy first before you supersede it with something else? But in a sense, Levinas wants to leave you hanging there because he wants to leave open that you want to go beyond Husserl, right? But it's not because he thinks that the later published books of Husserl are going to solve this thing. It's books already published by the time this was written, but not by Husserl. Fair question.
Yeah. So the the other one that he seems to only get to in the last two paragraphs of the conclusion that has been bugging me, and I've brought it up in a couple of previous ones, is intersubjectivity.
Yes.
And I'm partly driven by that because I've been digging into Nikolai Hartmann, who's also contemporaneous with these, who directly addresses that question much more thoroughly than it seems like any of them do. But I remember the one little book on how is my red the same as your red, basically brought up that question of intersubjectivity. How do I have my experience of red somehow connect to your experience of red? And and I think that's just another hole that Levinas leaves hanging.
And Levinas is not leaving that one hanging because he thinks even Heidegger plugs it. It's because he thinks he does.
Yeah.
Now, not at the time when he's writing this because he's too young, but by later Levinas, right? You know, the question of the intersubjective and the ethical specifically within the intersubjective is going to be not the theoretical intersubjective, but the ethical intersubjective is going to be Levinas's own favorite place to take phenomenology, right?
So I got the feeling that he was giving a lead for himself at that point too. Yeah.
Yes, and part you have to understand that there were other people in parallel in all this, people like Max Schiller, who are already also doing phenomenology with more of a focus on that ethical side, and maybe even also on a theological side that you also find in Levinas. What you get in Heidegger is this focus on the practical, but it's still very much on the individual, right? There is still a definite experience of being with others, discussing being in time, etc. But from Levinas's point of view, it's all as that appears in and to the individual consciousness, right? So in that sense, it's not to Levinas a full-throated enough version of intersubjectivity. From Heidegger's point of view, Levinas's supposedly full-throated intersubjectivity is really an inauthentic thing. He thinks that there are aspects of the Levinas focus on the ethical and the intersubjective that Heidegger would regard as living in the they self, in the image that one has in the eyes of others. In that sense, Heidegger is more like Rousseau in a distinguishing amour propre, amour de soi, right, kind of way, that the extent to which a person views themselves reflected in the opinions of others about himself, right, is the extent to which he is an anxious, civilized social being, right, from Rousseau's point of view, and in Heidegger's point of view, to that extent, he is living inauthentically because he is not being an individual self. And there's elements of that in Heidegger that you also find in Kierkegaard, in a way. But there's this, I think of it this way, strident emphasis on the individual in Heidegger that Levinas himself doesn't like at all. And this is not primarily a question of the theoretical status of the intersubjective. It's more of a Levinas's ethical judgments against that, right? Rather than theoretical judgments against whether or not it captures the phenomena of Dasein correctly or something like that. He doesn't want it to be true rather than doesn't think that it is true, if I can put it that way. But anyway, that's way later debates. So you're right to think that there are sort of open questions left there on these sorts of topics, and that he is leaving them open because it's 1930 and these are all fights they're going to be having after this, or some of them with Heidegger have already started. Levinas won't break with Heidegger on that intersubjective point until later, the 1950s, really. After probably the letter on humanism by Heidegger is the point where that break really starts, which that humanism of the other is kind of a reply to. Okay, so fair questions to bring up. Unfortunately, they go beyond the confines of just understand Husserl here, and they're just ways in which Levinas is situating Husserl within the broader movement of phenomenology and existentialism, so to speak. So if you want to read 6 books and situate all of Husserl within all of them, these leftovers would become the theme, so to speak. But you kind of have to already have the Husserl part solidly in hand to understand how those other things develop, right? which is why I wanted to focus on the Husserl first. I mean, we read a bunch of Heidegger already. We read Being and Time a couple of years ago, but because it's kind of a bigger impact book, Husserl is, a lot of his impact is coming from having enabled all that and created this starting point for Heidegger. But his own position isn't simply the Heidegger position, right? And one of the reasons I wanted to cover this is just to show that phenomenology is a bigger continent than just Heidegger, and that it's people like Levinas also show that it's a movement, a method, and a continent, not a particular island within it that Heidegger has staked out for himself, so to speak. So.
Yeah, same thing I'm finding as I dig into Hartmann. There's a broader realm than even Heidegger when you get into Hartmann, and he's been just completely left out of the English world, to put it simply. Some of his best works have just only in the last 2 years been translated into English. So that's part of the issue that I'm having with that. The other specific that I had some trouble with was when Levinas did the distinction between Bergson and Husserl.
Yes.
And that one I had a little trouble really ferreting out what he was trying to tease apart there. So
yeah, and it's fair to say this is the same history problem of Levinas is always situating Husserl in a historical progression that is clear to Levinas, but he isn't telling you everything about why, right? He's just sort of assuming some of these things. Bergson and Bergson's focus on life philosophy and on the interior experience of time, right, are 19th century backgrounds to some of these same concerns in Husserl. From Husserl's point of view, Bergson didn't have the theoretical machinery to attack those problems correctly, but he was raising some of those concerns. Bergson is primarily someone who is objecting to the tendency of the logical positivist philosophers to present something like a scientific view of the world as the entire truth about the world, and everything that doesn't fit into them as guff and nonsense, if I can put it that way, right? And Bergson is saying this is not true to either the methods needed for doing history properly, or the interior of our experience, or a bunch of other things, right? So Bergson is primarily a critic of that sort of positivist, scientistic, naturalistic tendency in the late 19th century, and particularly trying to get at that as the two propositions would be something like history needs its own method, and this move back towards interior consciousness experience, life thing which later becomes life world philosophy or anything like that, is already he's already pointing in that direction as something that Bergson thinks is needed as a corrective to this this tendency. If I can put it this way, too many of the people around him think that you can study human nature by experimenting on human beings as though they're lab rats, and thinking that whatever is true of your observations of the monkey is likely going to be the thing which tells you the most about human nature. And the one thing you don't have to do is look in the interior of consciousness about how human beings are actually distinct, right? Bergson thinks you're going to have to look in the interior of consciousness to know how human beings are actually distinct. You're going to have to understand history from the inside. You're going to have this kind of sympathetic understanding of the content of other minds, all this kind of stuff, and that to Bergson is something which the the positivist psychology methods of the 1870s, 1880s around him is failing at abysmally, right? Something like that. In a way, you can say that some of the same objections that you see in Bergson are followed through by Husserl and later existentialism. Okay, and that's sort of the commonality that that Levinas is trying to point out here. So he does these things where he'll say, Bergson approached this problem this way and was worried about this distinction or that distinction, or described time this way, and he'll try to explain to his French audience what Husserl thinks on a topic by using the contrast with how he's different from Bergson. And he's assuming that the audience is completely familiar with Bergson, right, and knows Bergson like the back of their hand and is completely familiar with all of his doctrines. And so if he just says he differs from Bergson on this point by X, right, he doesn't have to say a single word about Bergson. He's just going to help you understand Husserl by seeing this nuanced difference from Bergson. If you don't have, like, buckets of Bergson under your belt, this does not help at all. You have to kind of already have a take on Bergson. You have to have not only already read him, but already have opinions on where you liked him and where you didn't like him and where you thought he was unsound to see how Husserl could be improving upon him. And Levinas doesn't explain much of that, or he explains it very quickly. So that can be quite opaque. But from Levinas's point of view, right, Bergson is the predecessor, Husserl is the guy he's describing, and Heidegger is a successor in a chain of linear development towards developing this practical life philosophy view of the world, right? Okay, fair question. It's all this.
Which still leaves it a little bit anthropocentric in my feelings. That as we are continuing to understand
Absolutely.
what can and can't do, we are tugging at the edges of that anthropocentrism.
Yeah, absolutely. And for someone like Husserl, this is a methodological necessity to get the foundations of science right at all, because the naturalists around him are trying to understand how logic works in their theories with the methods of empirical psychology, and that's hopeless. For someone like Heidegger, he just doesn't care, right? For some of the later cognitive science people, they care about this phenomenology and existentialism stuff primarily for the things they think that it did manage to discover about psychology, or about the structure of consciousness or something like that, and they exactly want to generalize it to things that they can learn about the natural world. But that's fundamentally because they're still convinced naturalists, and they're still trying to do positivist naturalist science of empirical psychology on human beings as well as anything else. And they view all of this stuff as just useful information for that other project. They're not changing their project because of this critique, right? They're getting their scientific project completely independently of this, and to the extent that Husserl's intent is to be a critique of that kind of scientism or that kind of naturalism, they just aren't paying any attention to that at all, right? It's not that they have a refutation of it. It's not that they have a refutation of it, or that they have have reason for disagreeing with it. It never occurs to them that anyone could disagree with it, right?
Yeah, I think we're still stuck in that to a great extent.
Yeah. I would say that a lot of people are, but not everybody. People who are informed with the continental philosophical tradition aren't. And this is one of the reasons why people on that side of a kind of divide within universities and departments don't understand the people in other ones. It's the reasons that the people in the cognitive science department and the people in the and postmodernists in the anthropology department can't talk to each other, right? Yeah. Okay. Raphael or Bob, what do you go by actually?
Either or. If I want to sound smart, I go for Raphael.
Okay, Raphael. Fair enough. So
what I had.
Go ahead.
I first of all read the wrong book, so I downloaded Philosophers and Their Realities by Etienne Wilson, Being and Some Philosophy. So I read through some of it, but I just thought I'd start attending more often.
Yep. Okay.
Well, and just listen to you guys, and it's mind blowing just hearing it. So I'm having a good time just being here and listening to.
Great. But did you get to any of this one?
No. Okay. I only read like half Being and Some Philosophers.
Got it.
And I was enjoying that quite a bit. But
got it.
Hearing you guys talk about it when you know exactly what everybody has written and you can reference it, and the way you said it, he expected people to know exactly what the other person had written,
yes,
so on and so forth.
Yes.
You recognize that and you can talk about it. That's like, to me, this is like a class almost. In your amazing teacher. So
Okay, thank you.
I just need that for now. And
Great.
I'm going to hope to keep up with the reading the next couple of meetings.
Great. So you're definitely welcome. The other thing I'll just say is, from that situation, it's extremely useful to get questions about which parts of this make sense and which parts don't make sense, right? You don't have to assume that the fully informed, fully digested, version of the reading is the only question that matters, right? What the heck is he talking about with the eidetic level, right? That was Joe's question basically, and it's a perfectly good question, right? There's no way you're going to understand this stuff if you can't grab things like that, and just having questions like that is perfectly useful here, and likely for everybody, not just for you, right? Each question, it probably occurred to somebody else too. Maybe they thought they understood it, but maybe they weren't perfectly clear on it, right? Okay, this is all good. I want to like start with our actual readings now, so that basically there's kind of three topics. There's ideas or essences, not quite the same thing, eidetic level, but idea reasoning, so to speak, in Husserl. Then there's philosophical intuition, that's like the chapter 7 part, and then you're just sort of wrapping up overall what we think of the Husserl we read. The first point to understand about ideas in Husserl's sense is they're not the same as forms. If you're a Platonist, forms and ideas are almost synonyms. Not so here. Other thing to keep in mind is that his whole main second book is just called Ideas, right? So if you want to know what he thinks about ideas, he's got a giant book to tell you. You've got 350 pages if you want to know all the details of what he thinks about ideas. The difficulty is not that he doesn't tell you what he thinks about them, but he tells you in so long-winded a manner that it's hard to follow all of it. Okay, but let's start with the difference between forms and ideas. What does Husserl mean by a form? For him, forms are the things that people talk about in logic, and ideas are the things that people talk about in everything else. Why do I say that? Because for him, a form is something so general that it doesn't care what kind of thing you're talking about. An object as such, for every A there exists, kind of number relations. This is a part of that. This follows from that. Ifs and thens and negation, the kinds of things you have as operators in formal logic. To him, that's all form, and it's form because it applies to any object of thought. It doesn't care what kind of thing it is. Ideas do care about what kind of thing it is. So if you're thinking something like extended objects have color, that's not to him a logical deduction kind of thing. It depends upon the content of the kind of thing you're talking about, right? It has, in his terms, material content. When he says material, he doesn't mean like external matter. He just means matter as opposed to form. He means it depends what kind of thing you're talking about. It's not just a pure logical or pure set kind of thing. So ideas have material content. They have particularity to them. They have something that they're trying to talk about, and they are inheriting characteristics or relations or facts about them that are true from the kind of thing that they're talking about. And this is related to this whole idea that there are sort of regional ontologies of things. A physical material extended particular outside your head, right? As soon as I tell you that that's the class of thing I'm talking about, I've placed it into a regional ontology. I've placed it into a kind of thing I'm thinking about. Chairs, tables, books, whatever. All of those things considered as material objects are in the same class, and there's all kinds of things that are true about all of them that they inherit from their class. It's just the entire region of being I'm talking about, those material particular things, right, have all kinds of things that are true about them that don't depend upon whether or not it's a chair or a table or a book, but just do depend upon the fact that they are a material particular, not a number, not a mood, right? So which kind of thing it is matters for what's going to be true about it. Okay, so that's the way in which ideas are distinct from forms, right? Forms are purely logical. They don't care about what kind of thing it is. object as such, true or false, if and then, negation. Those are all logical things. But these things which depend upon the kind of thing that it is are not going to be formal, they're going to be ideas. So that's distinguishing it on one side, in a sense, from something way too general to be an idea. Logic is way too general to be an idea for Husserl. The other thing that's being distinguished from, though, is the actual particular objects, right? When we're talking about, ideas about material particulars, I'm not talking about that chair over there. I'm talking about something which is more generally true than about a single particular picked out in an area. When I'm talking about ideas about mathematics, I'm not talking about the number 3, right? There may be things which are true of the number 3 because they're true of number as such. In the fact that the number 3 is odd will be, one of them, that I can determine that all numbers are all natural numbers are even or odd, right? Whatever. It's a natural number, not just a real number, whatever. There may be other things like that I can know about it. But if I'm just thinking about the number 3 and nothing else, that's too particular to be the kind of eidetic content. 3 might be a little bit hard there because we think of it as already general. It's much easier with the sensual particulars, so to speak. That couch over there, right? There's a sense in which that couch over there is already the amalgam of a whole bunch of experiences, right? I've already put together a bunch of things to have anything like a concept of that couch over there that I'm looking at. But it's still a particular, right? Okay. And here's the first fundamental point about ideas for Husserl. He claims that we can see ideal relations in the material particulars directly, right? We don't just have like this, and when I say have, I mean have present to consciousness. We don't just have this particular couch over here, right? I can pick out the couch shape about it. I can approximate that couch shape with a couple of rectangles, right? I can recognize its gray color and put that color in a color scale, right? All those things that I'm seeing about it are ways in which I'm noticing things about it which are more general than that particular couch. In that sense, they're more idea-like. They're more abstract, if you like, but they're aspects of the actual experienced couch which are not as individual as the couch, right? So they are general things that I see in the particular. In Platonic, when we're talking about Platonic ideas, young Socrates is asked in the Parmenides, what are these ideas you're talking about? And he says, well, maybe there are thoughts in our minds and maybe they're patterns in things, right? Those are sort of his two versions of what an idea might refer to. Husserl is agreeing with both and equating them. The patterns you see in things, the thoughts you have in your mind about the patterns you see in things are what he means by ideas, right? The idea level is extracting the concept-like generality from the particular that you have in your intuition. Okay. So that's what he means by ideas in the first place. So the couch over there is some material particular, whatever. The fact that I recognize this thing about its shape, right, and I consider that there are other things of that shape, right. That is idea-like thinking. I've already extracted something general from the particular, and that thing that I've extracted is it has whatever relations it has in a purely ideal sphere. And this is a critical thing for him. As soon as something is at that purely ideal level, at that abstract level, if you want to put it that way, it is in an entirely different sense. It's not a material particular anymore. I've dropped it into another domain of being, right? I'm thinking about it as a pure concept, right? So it has a different, it's already in a different regional ontology, so to speak. The shape of the couch is not in the same regional ontology as the whole empirical couch. To see this, just recognize that the whole empirical couch had a beginning in time, has an ending in time, is affected by the category of time in a certain way, and the shape of the couch isn't, right? So the shape of the couch is as considered as an abstract thing, which it is some outside time invariant mathematical-like object about the couch. It's a, something you could see in a CAD diagram about the couch, right? It would be true in the CAD diagram of the couch and in the picture of the couch and in a, architect's drawing of where the couch goes in a planar, some plan view of my living room, right? So it already has this abstract detached from its instance in time material particularity, that it's no longer so individual, right? Okay. So this is the first point about the kind of ideas. Yes.
I didn't want to interrupt speaking. Yeah, exactly. How do you define the differences between the couch on an architect's plan, and so on and so on?
Yes.
All seems like ideas that are very hard for the computer to grapple, but things that
Yes.
we intuitively understand sometimes.
Yes, and one of Husserl's points is that he says that these objects are constructed by consciousness, right? So there is an element of construction of an intended referent of our thoughts involved in each of these things. We're picking out some particular aspects, right, from the stream of consciousness, so to speak, and those particular aspects and the abstractions about them picked out are the actual object that we're reasoning about. In some sense, he's explaining how abstraction works, right? But he's viewing this shift of attention and the different intended objects of consciousness and the projections of sets of characteristics that divide up the world that way. These are the characteristic acts of consciousness, right? It's how the consciousness organizes lived experience into the world, right? Lived experience is not a disorganized chaos. It's this articulated, constructed, segmented, and leveled thing, right? With all these different aspects picked out of it and all this structure thrown onto it. And all that structure throwing on an aspect picking out is eidetic reasoning, right? A Nietzsche beforehand would say they are categorical thinking, throwing forms over the pre-existing chaos in order to capture it for our purposes, right? But to Husserl, it's much more truth-preserving than that. All of the things that all of these projections and constructions we're doing are working with things that are really there, right? And that not only are really there, they are the beings for us, right? These different constructed aspects are what things are. They aren't anything else. They're made out of these, I'm going to put it this way, these sorted constructions. And all the things that we're trying to think about, we're not trying to think about the raw stream of consciousness. We're not just trying to think about that in some different way or in some more organized way. The things we're actually trying to think about, that which thoughts are about, are exactly these organized, quote, abstractions, unquote, which aren't simply abstractions because everything's built out of them, right? To call them abstractions is to misunderstand how necessary and general they are, right? Everything that we think about has this constructed by consciousness character. It just has different characteristics depending on which area of being we've projected it into. Considered as a mathematical fact, considered as an abstract shape, considered as a material particular in time, right? All of those are considered as interpretations in Heidegger speak, right? All of those considered as are the way in which this object is understood as, is taken as an object in this or that different region of being. Okay. And the characteristic thing in Husserl is that each of these regions of being gets its own ontology. And when he says its own ontology, he doesn't just mean, he means what it means for something in that region to be, and the kinds of characteristics that it necessarily has, and some of the basic relations among them. And this is way closer to what we mean by an ontology in later computer science terms than anything you found in philosophers before him, right? Extended objects have color, right? That's the kind of thing which is an ontological statement to Husserl. It's a fact about the regional ontology of extended object. Anything which is extended object has to have a surface. The surface has to have some color to it, even if that color is gray or is unknown, right? So it inherits having a surface from being extended, and it inherits having a color from having surfaces. It also inherits only being able to be viewed from one side at a time, from being extended, right? So that way in which things inherit the fact that they have certain kinds of properties from the structure of the kind of the thing that they are is what he means by a regional ontology, right? Things of this kind have characteristics of this kind, right? And the striking claim that he's making here is that these are all things which are true. They're necessarily true. They have you can reason about them with certainty the same way as you reason in mathematics, but they're not tautologies. They're not things which are analytic in the sense that they're purely logical propositions. They all depend upon the kind of thing you're talking about. They all have material requirements. The claims about things which are extended having a surface and having color doesn't mean that 3 has a color, because 3 isn't an extended thing. It doesn't make sense to say 3 has a color. It didn't inherit that requirement to have a color from its regional ontology of numbers, right? Okay. And this is a very different take on what general ideas are than we got either in Plato or we got from the nominalists who discount them as just names we've given to things that don't refer to anything real. Okay, so what are the particular problems that come up with this view? I mean, it's on the surface, it's a very attractive view because it lets us construct these objects of different kinds and ticket and sort them correctly, much the way we would sort of in later computer science understanding of things. Okay, so the first question is about where is the line between the truths which are truths of the regional ontology that you can know with certainty and the merely empirical inductive truths, right? The characteristic black swan question, right? If you have a notion of swan, where the intended object of your swan is, these white aquatic birds of a certain size with a certain, typical shape, then if you included in your concept of what you want to intend by them that they're white, the first black swan, sticks out and worries you, right? But somehow you can tell that the black swan is still a swan and is violating your prior projection of what swanness was, and you would never take a black crow as evidence against the possibility of black swans, right? If you say all swans are white, right, and so on, it gives you as counter evidence, here is a black crow, all you say is that's just a crow, right? And if he gives you 3 other black birds, none of which is a swan, he says, no, see, you didn't understand what I meant by swan. You're giving me birds. Birds is a higher genre. I'm not talking about birds when I say swan. You've mistranslated my concept. The intentional referent of my concept here is this narrower thing, swan, not this wider thing, bird. And at that point he says, okay, and he gives you a black swan. And at that point you realize, oh, my belief that swans were always white was only an inductive truth. It wasn't a truth of the structure of my concepts. But where the line is between the merely inductive belief that swanness required whiteness to discovering, no, what I meant by swanness can still be there without whiteness being there, so that the color becomes an accidental, not an essential property of swanness, right? That's a fuzzy line. And it's hard to see how, that's hard to see. One of Husserl's problems is to delineate the way in which inductive truths like that are not simply truths of the ontology, right? To distinguish one from the other. To let you have ways of picking out what you mean by swan that can have expectations about them that empirical reality can falsify, right? Okay. And this gets slippery in ways that bothered other logicians. How can this get slippery? So the favorite example that the other analytic philosophers would have is, is the present king of France bald, right? And one guy says, I can say that the proposition, the present king of France is bald, is true, and is true with certainty because I'm a Republican. I don't believe in kings, right? So any proposition about an empty set, you can say, has a truth value of true rather than false. But that's because I have a certain commitment about logic rather than just a commitment about politics. Another guy says, is the present king of France bald? And he thinks the answer is yes, but that's because he's an Orleanist, and he thinks that only the line of kings from 1830 is legitimate, not the other lines of kings, right? Whereas a Bonapartist or a restorationist would disagree with him because their heirs apparent, have full heads of hair, right? So in this case, they're disagreeing about the referent, right, rather than the proposition. If they all agreed that this person over here is who I'm picking out with the present king of France, they would agree on his baldness or lack thereof. What they don't agree about is whether there are kings of something called France and which person is picked out by it. Okay. What's the point of that? The point of that is these people could entirely agree on all of their eidetic levels of what counts as kings, what counts as what properties kings have, that they are people, etc., but disagree about all of their empirical ascriptions of those things. They agree on the hierarchy with which they're organizing the world, but they disagree about the match between that hierarchy and the world, right? So you can have, in the case of the swan, right, it's there can be empirical propositions which don't seem to fit into your hierarchy and upset parts of your hierarchy. In the other case, you can agree entirely on your hierarchy, but disagree about the mapping between it and the world. Okay, so all of those concerns were things which later bothered people about this idea that you could have intuitive knowledge of these regional ontologies and hierarchy relations that you could just trust and reason about them sort of apodictically and be certain of the conclusions you arrived at. Okay. Husserl is not concerned about those things, right? If you discover the black swan later, you just recognize later that whiteness was not one of the essential attributes of swans. It doesn't change where swans exist in your hierarchy or the other things you use to reason about them. And he's not worried about the disagreements of reference, so to speak, either. Those are, particular judgments. The reason that this doesn't bother him is he's not trying to come up with some sort of logical machinery that tells you, if you apply only these rules, all of your arguments or all of your transformations will be truth preserving. He's not like that at all. He's not trying to give you a syntactic system of reasoning that if you conform to will ensure, the truth of later reasoning. He's always telling you to go back to your intuition of the thing itself to verify its truth, because his notion of truth isn't a syntactic notion of truth in the first place. Something is not true to Husserl because you arrived at it by a chain of application of rules that you decided were legal. He's not a rule follower, right? He's a go look at the thing itself follower, advocate, right? And the intuitions involved in these sort of regional ontologies are only going to they have intentions behind them of what the person who came up with them was intending to refer to. And the only way you're going to understand them is if you respect those intentions and treat them as sovereign, right? Whatever the person was trying to talk about when he said the present king of France is bald, right? If you object to this because there are no kings of France, because you're a Republican, you've just completely misunderstood what the person making the statement was saying. He was using that formula to refer to an actual determinate individual that you can find in the world. And if you don't follow his version of what that referent was that was picked out by it, you're just not listening to him. You're just not reading him. He wasn't trying to talk about a set of words, right? He was trying to talk about a material particular in the world, well, a person in the world. Okay, so from Husserl's point of view, if you pay attention to the intentions, the intended objects and intended meanings of the person of the thinker or thought laying down any of these schemes, and follow them that way, and then seek to verify them only with your direct intuitions of the things to which they are referring, then you will communicate with the mind that was thinking that way. Either of them could still be wrong, right? Not the point, but you can understand the thing he's talking about. And his claim is that this is how all understanding that does happen actually happens. It's how all truth actually happens that is known to a particular mind. And it's also how all true communication happens between any two of them. That they see the other person's conceptual scheme, follow it with respect, and then verify intuitively that the same relation occurs or doesn't. Craig, was there a question about this? Sorry, Craig, I saw you add something to the chat. Sorry, Craig, you're on mute.
Just responding to Raphael on a book I recently acquired.
Okay, great, great.
Robert Poley has done a 2-volume set on theory and applications of ontology. First volume is philosophical, second volume is computer applications.
Gotcha,
So
yes.
Excellent 2 volumes if you can afford them.
Yes, yes. I can say that. Go ahead.
So I found them on Library Genesis, so I'll give you.
Yeah, I can say that in my day job, right, you know, getting ontologies correct for computer systems, right, you know, something I have to do all the time, right? And these issues of, does someone's hierarchical understanding match someone else's, and what data elements is it based upon? It's a very live issue, right? You know, we have a client right now where one of the things they're trying to do is, you know, use 11 different data sources about commercial real estate and mash them up to be able to ask questions about them. Okay, but what does each of them mean by a property? And I don't mean a property in the sense of an attribute something could have. I mean a property as in, you know, a real estate thing in the world. Do they mean a parcel? Do they mean a building? Do they mean, you know, a collection of those things that was transacted in once? Do they mean the version of those that was, you know, had something that was added to it in 2003, or the whole thing that has, you know, one owner now? How does that change when the ownership changes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So the practical problem is, you know, you can see how each one of these sources may approach that problem, and they'll use some data element to map between them. But if you're going to try to reason about them together, you have to have some own version of an ontology that you fit them all into, right? And it has to be able, it cannot use attributes from about one of those things in the if its piece of the ontology does not match your piece of the ontology, because you don't even know what it's referring to, right? Anyway, so these things are definitely, you know, live issues in the practical world across multiple data sources.
But also, without it being on computer science, it seems like something consistent in at least my family, that somebody will be referring to something, but because you don't know exactly what they're referring to, it's just the thing, right? So
yes,
they get a knowledge because you're not understanding them, but because there's so many things that could fall into the category of thing or thingamajig, whatever way they choose to communicate.
yes.
So that seems to be like a practical issue of these ontological.
Yes, certainly, and every level of miscommunication is possible there. What Husserl is trying to point out is that constructing such objects in order to refer to them and to use them as the actual reference for not only statements about things or claims about things, but even for thoughts about things, is simply what consciousness does, right? And all the things that we experience, let alone have make sentences about that have truth content, right, are of this character, of this kind of synthetic, constructed, regional character. Okay, I want to talk quickly about what he means by the eidetic reduction, right? Because there's 2 fundamental reductions, maybe more, but there's 2 fundamental reductions in Husserl: the phenomenological reduction, which we talked about last time a bit, and the eidetic reduction, and they're not the same thing at all. The phenomenological reduction we talked about last time, we'll talk about again for chapter 7, is if you're trying to focus on how consciousness thinks about something, you kind of have to look away from the thing it's thinking about and towards the thinking, right? This kind of reflective move of I watch myself thinking about something. So I have to consider my thoughts about the chair as thoughts and not as about the chair, right? Yes, they're also about the chair, and I notice they're also about the chair, but I have to kind of put in brackets or suspend the fact that they're meant to be about something outside my mind in the room with me, the chair, and I have to instead consider that aspect of them which is purely thought-like and interior to my consciousness, right? Okay. The phenomenological reduction way of doing that is to suspend all of the propositions, all the aspects of the thinking about something, which are transcendent theses, which depend upon some claim about how the real world really is, the world outside my consciousness really is, right? If you suspend it in a manner which is kind of akin to Cartesian doubt, you suspend all of the empirical real world, transcendent world beliefs, entailments, or claims about a set of thoughts or experiences, then you can focus on the just how you are thinking about them side of it, right? And this is focusing on the phenomenological layer. Why is it the phenomenological layer? It's focusing on only what appears in the interior of consciousness about them. You're not making deductions about that. You're just focusing on the appearance of the apparentness of the appearances, so to speak. Okay, that's what we mean by the phenomenological reduction. It's suspending belief in transcendent facts about something just in order to shift the focus to the thinking about them as opposed to the thing thought about. Okay. None of that actually implies any actual doubt about the things you're thinking about, right? It's just a move to get you to focus on the thought-like. Okay. The eidetic reduction is you're looking at some actual particular, right? In any area of intuition, right? Any area of being, and you're looking away from its singularity, its individuality, it's this oneness, right? The exactly this oneness that you can point at that couch over there, right? I want to keep only the couchness. I want to keep only the shape. I only want to keep the grayness. I want to keep all the things which are idea-like about my understanding of the couch and drop the parts which are purely individual, right? There's a sense in which it is a single individual in a particular ontology as given to my intuition. But if I want to look away from that, the eidetic reduction is to look away from that to see only the general idea-like things in it, and especially the essential ones. Why does this matter? The claim is that you can do this by a mere shift of attention with any particular that you're thinking about, right? You can consider it not as an individual but as an instance, and look at what commonalities it has with other instances. And the ability to do this is for Husserl the kind of proof or evidence that we can see ideas, that we can see the general in the particular. We prove that is how we construct the objects as the beings that they are and project them into these aspects by doing it, by considering that chair over there not as that chair over there, but as something with this particular shape that I could also see in a drawing, right? The commonality of the drawn thing in that chair over there is something I can deliberately shift my focus, the focus of my attention to, right? Like when the artist is looking at a scene and he's just seeing how he would draw it on his canvas, right? And so he's abstracting from the fact that it's this whole landscape in 3 dimensions, and he's just extracting the outline form that he needs to draw across the page to get the line of the horizon correct, right? That same kind of operation applied to anything that any particular you're looking at is what he's talking about as the eidetic reduction. Okay, and this is integral to his theory of what other people would call abstraction. He's teaching you how abstraction works by having you do it on lots of individual particular cases. Okay. Is the eidetic reduction clear, and how it's not the phenomenological reduction at all? Okay. Okay. What else do we learn from the eidetic reduction? The answer is we learn the mode of existence of ideas themselves. Ideas are not material particulars in the room with us the way the chair is, right? They are too general for that and too thought-like for that.
This idea, this distinction between the modes of existence, which is one of the most important things I took away from this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very enlightening.
Yes, and the thing which you find in Husserl is he makes these claims about these different modes of existence, and he's not founding them on some deduction from their place in his theory, right? He wants you to see it in the particular examples he gives you. He wants you to consider three abstractly, not those three objects over there, right? Or he wants you to consider the shape of the couch as opposed to the whole couch, so to speak. And he will use examples like that to show you how the manner in which one of those intended objects of consciousness differs in its mode from another one. Then he'll also give you examples of how the criteria of what it means for something to exist differs from one of these regions to another, but only after you're aware of those regions. He's first going to get you to see those regions by looking at particular examples. And this, always going back to the intuition of the particular example, is the characteristic phenomenological method in Husserl, right? It's what makes him from my point of view, a grounded phenomenologist, not someone who's just like laying out a giant Hegelian dialectical theory or something, right? It's why he's, in a sense, of all the phenomenologists, he's staying closest to the ground, right? Because you can always reproduce the intellectual experiment that he did, so to speak, to follow the step he took. Okay, but the critical thing here, what do we learn about the existence of ideas? We learn that ideas are intentional objects of consciousness. We learn that from the shifts of attention that can get us to focus on them as opposed to other things about the particulars that we're looking at, right, in any given area. We're learning something about their abstractness. We're learning something about their constructedness. Intentional object of consciousness is already a pretty complicated formula for one of these things. But this is Husserl's answer to the famous problem of the universals. In what sense are the universals? How are the universals different from the particulars? Are they separate existent real exterior things, often the Hyper-Uranian realm of the ideas, as in Plato? Husserl's answer is ideas are intentional objects of consciousness. That's what they are. So that accounts both for their thought-likeness that we saw in the first half of the Platonic formula, that ideas are like thoughts and minds, and as objects, not subjects, but objects of consciousness, they are intentional objects. They are also like patterns in things, the other half of the Platonic formula of what ideas might be. So Husserl's way of putting those two things together is ideas are intentional objects of consciousness. So his partial rehabilitation of Plato is, insofar as ideas are intentional objects of consciousness, they are real, right? That's the kind of being they are, the kind of being they have and the kinds of things that they are, but as such, they are real. Okay, so that's his rehabilitation of, he's going to rehabilitate Plato to that extent. Okay. The other thing that we learn along the way is what essences are. Essences are the idea properties that something has that cannot be otherwise, or the thing is not one of the things of that kind, right? So sounds that don't have a volume aren't sounds, right? typical example. Material particulars that don't have an extent in time over which they endure aren't material particulars, right? There are no material particulars outside of the category of time. It's part of what you mean by it, right? So that's what counts as an essential property, and those need to be distinguished from the perhaps inductively believed, but only empirically accidental properties, like the whiteness or blackness of swans, right? It may be a question in any particular case into which category a given attribute of a thing falls. Is it essential or is it accidental, right? But that there are essences which are the set of attributes or properties that something has to have to be an entity of a certain kind, right, is what he means by essences. And the claim is that beings actually have essences, and not just for us, right? Beings have essences. This is a typical Husserlian claim. There could be some later thinkers who think that the categories in which you divide things up are such that claims of the essentiality of this or that are always completely arbitrary, right? And that there's no such thing as essences in things, or that all essences are projected there by the mind. Not where Husserl is coming out on this, right? Husserl thinks that there are essences that are real in the old scholastic sense of independent of the opinions of the particular mind trying to think about them, right? Minds either understand them or they don't, right? If you have a different notion of swan, you're just not understanding the concept swan, right? Okay, so all of this is just getting through all this stuff in chapter 6 about what he means by ideas and essences as these things constituted by consciousness. I should pause and let people react, give me questions about any of this, because it's a big topic. Joe, questions?
Well, I thought I'd throw in some of the statute, because I've often wondered, one of the fuzzy details about the way we use language in the modern world is when we throw the word reality out.
Mm-hmm.
And that always brings up the phenomenological, is it real, and stuff like that. And I find this to be a very interesting contribution to that appreciation, because I can see that as he described it, we have three different ways in which we could understand something as being real, equally real, in our thought, in our relationship to it. And this helps us, in fact, to relate to it, to grasp it, to include it in our whole frame of life, planning and stuff. So that struck me as being a very nice organizing detail that I hadn't gotten from anybody else. From what we discussed so far, I'm also very pleased to see somehow that you brought Heidegger back into the picture, because I really enjoyed being in time when we did 3 years ago. I'm thinking, but it's silly, that we should just do it again, because there's so much in there that I would like to go over again, and I'm just doubt that I have the student natureship, the scholarship, the discipline to just sit down and read it myself. But that would be something that I think worthwhile to do.
So
and I like the emphasis on individualism personally.
So if I may, I mean, one thing I can recommend doing along those lines, if you want, is to just try reading the basic introduction of being in time. This is like, especially, I guess it's the introduction part 2, working out the question of being, method and design of our investigation, right? So this is like very early on in being in time. And the point would be to read this thinking of this as Husserl as having provided this starting point, right? So it's not a question of trying to digest everything else that Heidegger is going to build on it, but just see to what degree the place where he's starting here is something that makes more sense having understood Husserl, right? Because that's the order in which it actually happened, right? And there's plenty of things here which are very difficult, very challenging material the first time through, with no understanding of where some of these things are coming from.
I do appreciate something called the circular spiral method of learning, and to revisit Heidegger at least through that introduction would be very useful.
Right.
Thank you.
So I can particularly point out a couple of things here on pages 60 and 62 of our edition. On 60, he's talking about what we mean by phenomena as just the way things actually appear, the showing itself in things. And like the second paragraph, he says, behind the phenomena of phenomenology, there's essentially nothing else. On the other hand, what is to become a phenomena can be hidden. The point being that phenomenology considers what is given. It's a givenness in things, right? This focus on the surface of what seems apparent without worrying about the fact that it's only a seems. There's no only about seems in phenomenology. Because you're studying the interior of consciousness, of how you actually think about things, all you have to do is watch. And only what is apparent when you're watching counts as phenomenological evidence. But when it counts as phenomenological evidence, there's no doubting it, right? You're not trying to ascertain something else that it means, right? In that sense, you have direct access to it. You can just see it because you're only trying to ask yourself, what do I see when I consider X? Okay. So that's already a striking piece of Husserlian starting point. But then there's also this incredibly dense formulation of what philosophy means on page 62 of Being in Times, where he says, first of all, he says that being is the transcendence pure and simple. And without Husserl, that's like completely opaque. What does he mean by the transcendence, right? He means the intended object of consciousness outside of consciousness, that consciousness intends to be what is not it, but is outside the mind, right? And here he gives that as a definition of what the term being means. There is as much being in any thought about something as there is an intended, not just in my consciousness about it, right? Joe,
it would make sense to me. Yeah, it would make sense to me in what you just said that if I simply tossed in the common colloquial word, the real world, it could be a transcendence in that sense.
Yes, but people often use the real world in this sense. Something is phenomenal if it's evident, and something is being if it's meant to be beyond just your consciousness. If your consciousness means it to be beyond just your consciousness, and in that sense, real. Why real? Because look, the original Greek word, not Greek, the Latin word "real" just means thing-like, right? It's the re of res of thing, with a adjectival al at the end, right? It's the thingly, right? So that's all real really means, is the thingly, right? But what makes something a thing? And the answer is it's constituted as an object of consciousness outside of consciousness that consciousness thinks is not just part of itself. That's what we kind of mean by thing. Well, that's the formula for being, as these guys are using it, right? So the later on that same page, Heidegger will give you this really compact definition of what philosophy is. Philosophy is universal phenomenological ontology, which takes this departure from the hermeneutic of Dasein, which as an analytic of existence has made fast the guiding line for all philosophical inquiry at the point where it arises to which it returns. Some of the later parts of that are his own method But why would he say that philosophy is universal phenomenological ontology? Well, universal in the sense that it's not meant to be particular to you. It's meant to be the always alreadys of things, structural things like that. Phenomenological because it's supposed to start from the evidence of the interior of consciousness and what is directly evident in that. It's not supposed to, construct theories about how it might be that way. It's supposed to look directly at the surface evidence in how things appear. And ontology, why? Because it's supposed to be about the being ascribed to things by the mind, right? The being of the ascribed as outside the mind by the mind, right? So what is evidently prescribed as being real outside the mind? That's what philosophy considers, according to Heidegger, right? So that whole starting point is pure Husserl, right? There's no way he would have, gotten that as a starting point that would tell him this is how philosophy should be done, and this is the kind of problematic it should consider, and this is, how it should analyze things, except that he's a student of Husserl and he's following in that, and Husserl's footsteps in that. Now, will he take all of that in Husserlian directions? Maybe not, but the starting point is pure Husserl, and it's very easy to go into being in time and see, compact formulations like that and say, where the heck did this come from? Like, this is from Mars. How did he come up with this, incredibly compact formula? And where does he get off telling me what philosophy is? And what does ontology have to do with it? And what is this being thing he's talking about, right? All of that is just its whole backstory if you know the Husserl well enough, right? It's steps made with motivation and evidence. Even if you're not going to agree with all that evidence, but it's steps made with motivation and evidence. You know why he's taking these steps, why he thinks they make sense. So I don't think we can go back and read all Being in Time after having Husserl, but you can definitely read that little introduction and see if at least where he starts, right, makes more sense. Yeah, okay. Craig, thoughts on all this idea stuff?
I think that you're teasing it apart really well.
Okay.
Seems to be getting there. I still have the problems of the process of developing new information on it. Even the process of us growing, that what we once held to be rigid changes as we grow, changes as we mature.
Sure.
And that's kind of left out of this in a sense. So we're still basically working on a construction that it's the best we can do at the time that could end up being changed later.
Right. I mean, it's fair to say that this is kind of the point you just made is kind of the direction that kind of structuralism went in both anthropology and psychology, which was to see this sort of way of looking at things as, yes, that's how we have to think, but look at all the different structural ways of dividing up the world we might at any given time have been or still be trapped in, so to speak, right? And viewing a particular, ontology map of the world that divides everything up into these categories and these different domains of being and has all these particular sets of material propositions for each of them, right? From the standpoint of a cultural or historical relativist, that's a particular great chain of being view that you're constructing a whole worldview around, and I go to the Trobriand Islanders and I don't recognize your version of it, right? They seem to be thinking in very different basic structural categories of the world than you are. And by the way, I can map them on this little diagram over here, and I can tell you what it looks like their structure of thinking about it is, and give you a version of what their basic conceptual map looks like that isn't yours, right? And that's what a lot of these structural anthropologists were doing, in the 30s to 50s, and people like Levi-Strauss became a hot thing in France because he seemed to be claiming that with evidence that the attempt to find universal ways of thinking like this was naive, right? and that what we were going to find instead was not some universal, but a soup of particularity. And then people like Thomas Kuhn were seen to be doing the same thing with the history dimension as opposed to the culture dimension. And so, yes, you could have, one of these ontologically sorted, ways of dividing up the world into different regions of being, but an appropriately large scientific revolution would knock one of those into a cocked hat and throw away half of it and, substitute something new, right? So this was the stuff that the structuralists were fascinated with, as to what degree these things are stable or unstable. And then the after them, the critics of them said, well, of course they're unstable because they're arbitrary, because they're either legislated like Nietzschean moralities, or they're these historically contingent semi-fated little logic puzzles that spin out of their own with their own development without much human intervention in them. Or maybe they're some mashup of the two, where willful interpretations, willful misinterpretations and misreadings can be put upon them to change them. So you got people who said that effectively it's the complete misunderstanding of the person's previous intention which drives the way that these things change. Okay, so that's where a lot of the postmodernists went with all of this, right? But in the original, Husserl was claiming a lot more accessibility of truth in all of this than the later structuralists or post-structuralists wanted to read out of it, right? He was not coming up with this different regional ontologies, constructed category stuff because he wanted to make all of this into something which was purely subjectively projected and therefore arbitrary, right? That's not what he was. He thought that this is no more arbitrary than the structure of the different regions of mathematics to him. And no one goes into algebra or real analysis and says, well, why did you come up with these categories? Why don't you come up with some of these other categories over here? And let's just throw away algebra, and let's just throw away real analysis, and let's have make up some other toy thing instead, right? This would get you an F in those classes, right? Because you would not be understanding the structures that were already thought through, created there, or why they matter, or how they hang together. It would just be failing to understand that subject. Sorry, Joe, question?
About 30 years ago, a friend of mine who was reading history was reading about the Nazis, and he came across a term, and he asked me, had I ever heard of it, and what did it mean? And the term was polylogism. Polylogism. And the only thing I could think of would be something that sort of might have started with the Marxist idea that the bourgeoisie think with a different brain level or different whatever between workers and capitalists. And then I could see how eugenics would fit in if you're a Nazi. And it seems to me that this categorization thing could be misused by idiots in that way. What do you think?
So first of all, just the go back to the Marxian, semi-Hegelian level of this for a second, right? So the Marxian idea in these things was that whatever differences there were in these structured things were themselves effects of basic structural things. So you wouldn't try to understand the structure of someone's thought or ideology. You just understood the forces and incentives that put him in this class or that class, and you treated the ideological as epiphenomenal on the class or the political. Okay, that was sort of the Marxian reductive view of these things, and the whole point of that was supposed to be that you could view the incentive structures of thought from the outside and predict their contents without having to go down the rabbit hole of taking seriously how the person inside that view of the world thinks. That idea kind of fell apart in the 20th century in the sense that people on both ends of the spectrum politically, or every end of the spectrum politically, pretty much agreed that there was a kind of independence of the ideological or intellectual level that was too powerful, too important for the actual processes of social change for them to be just overridden by trivial economic categories and attempts to understand things that way, right? Basically, you know, post Nietzsche, post Freud, etc., nobody thought that the intellectual, ideological, you know, quote, subjective or social was that simple, right? So all of those sorts of versions of this, you know, kind of thrown out as too naive, and all of the thinkers out of those traditions wanted to graft on all this new understanding of the wealth and depth of the social thinking onto their previous theories. Okay, that's just the first point to get sort of the marketing level out of the way. The thing that you get with the kind of cultural relativist stuff, either in the Nietzschean version or in the structuralist version, is once you decide that all of these different cultures, structures, or views are completely distinct from one another, and you don't have particularly rational ways of their intercommunicating, and their ways that they change are this sort of culminating point revolution of cognitive dissonance getting to be too much kind of change, right? Or willful misreadings and forgettings as the process whereby they change, then there's this disconnect within any one of these structures. There's a way of thinking about the world, but when you're looking at how they change from one to another, none of it's inside any one of those particular schools of thought. Instead, you've got some meta theory about how theories change, right? And your meta theory about how theories change becomes your actual theory of of historical or social change, right? None of which is, but it looks like it's particular to any one of these, you know, structures or ideologies. Here's the problem: all those meta theories about how these about that historical change have exactly the same structure as any one of these social structures or any one of these conceptual structures, right? There's no difference between a generalized theory about how cultures differ or the social structures of thought change, right? And the contents of one of the social structures, right? You can't tell the difference between your meta theory about how these things compete with one another and the contents of the interior of one of those theories, right? They have the same weaknesses, the same particularity, the same inability to process otherness, so to speak. Okay. So there were some people, some cynical people who looked at that and said, okay, that's clear. We know how to deal with that. The actual way that these things change is purely a social power dynamic. This is kind of the places where the people like Foucault come out. And he thinks of this as just rehabilitating Nietzsche, right? He has a meta theory of social change. The meta theory of social change is, how does power work, right? So you get this kind of you pass through this different views are all entirely distinct from one another into the only thing that matters is which one wins, right? It's pure power struggle, and that's honestly where some of those, you know, polylogism kind of ideas, you know, probably stem from. It's just thinking that the outer envelope theory of social change is political power, right? That's what actually changes the present and therefore changes the future way that people think, right? And I think that there's no question that it can be destructive. It can be extremist and can be destructive. It can also seem cynically accurate in the same way that Thrasymachus's theories of justice do, or, you know, that Machiavelli's theories of politics do, right? So there can be an attraction of it to a hard-nosed realist, cynical mind, independent of the perhaps deleterious nature of its consequences. Okay. To me, all of that is very far from this actual philosophical interest, right? Husserl is trying to get at how truth actually happens for us, right? He's trying to be a philosopher. He's not trying to be a social thinker. He's not trying to cause a social revolution. He's not trying to, you know, decide a political question. He's trying to understand how consciousness manages to arrive at actual truth. And for all the people that come along afterwards saying it doesn't, he's just, you know, sorry, you're wrong empirically, right? You've given me all these theories about how one culture and another culture differ so much that they can never communicate, and all they ever arrive at is opinion. And I see a giant flourishing technological civilization that knows tons of truth about the real world, right? Your Husserl's fundamental enemy is skepticism. And the people that claim that knowledge is impossible, right, are exactly the people he's arguing against, right? He's saying actual proves possible. You're telling me that knowledge can't happen, but I'm surrounded by it and it works. How? That's his question. That it works to him is just evidence. The theory which denies it is false, conflicts with the facts, right? So he's not worried about that. He's not trying to prove that knowledge is possible to people who doubt that it is possible, because he thinks the people that think that knowledge is impossible have already refuted themselves, right? He has, he's not worried. His enemy is skepticism, but he's trying to show how knowledge actually works, not because he thinks skepticism is so intellectually powerful an opponent, but because it's just socially a powerful opponent, because it's based upon the previous explanation of how knowledge works having been, so poor, right? So unconvincing. But that knowledge happens, that knowledge works. To Husserl, is just a fact. And the extreme relativists who want to claim that it doesn't actually happen, they're just silly to him because they're wrong empirically. Okay, I don't know if that helps. Raphael, questions, thoughts on any of this?
No questions.
Okay.
I'm just eagerly listening.
Sure. Okay, so Craig, any more about what I just went through, or do we want to move on to philosophical intuition?
No, I think we got there.
Okay, great.
We got plenty to cover in philosophical intuition.
Okay, so I know there were some things you wanted to ask about when we got there. I want to just, we talked about the being in time starting point. One way to think about this philosophical intuition thing is it's sort of the self-understanding of Husserl's own activity. He wants to explain how we do the kind of philosophy he's talking about. So this is where we finally get to the phenomenological reduction, which I've explained several times already, but Levinas, for some reason, tries to save until halfway through the last chapter of the book before he tells you about the fundamental method that makes any of this possible. But the kind of fundamental thing that you get in the last chapter is Husserl's explanation about how the philosophical attitude that he's calling reflection, or the phenomenological attitude, differs from what he calls the naive attitude, or the everyday common sense attitude. When he calls the everyday common sense attitude, he's not saying that it's wrong. It's just how we ordinarily live our lives, because we're not ordinarily engaged in philosophy, we're living, right? So when you're living, you care about the chair over there. You don't care about how you think about the chair over there or know things about the chair over there, right? You just deal with the actual objects that you need to interact with in the life world, so to speak. So there's a sense in which the naive or natural attitude is always orienting itself in the transcendent space of the objects of the real world, right, that we interact with. Okay. So the contrast to natural attitude is the reflective attitude of you are focused instead on how you think about each thing. And this is the why would you do this? The reason to do this is simply to understand how thought works. The reason to do this is to catch consciousness in the act, so to speak. And why? In order to understand the actual intention of consciousness itself. This is the claim. The claim is, if we want to know why consciousness works this way, we need to see what consciousness is about or is after in any of its acts. And to do that, we have to watch it doing what it's doing and think about why it's doing it, so to speak. Okay. Now, this is the kind of stuff that you would, later get in later cognitive science or, evolutionary psychology kind of thinking about things. But here it's purely at the philosophical level, right? He wants to know what is consciousness getting at in positing this external object outside my mind that has these characteristics and is divided up in this way that I can interact with, right? And for Husserl, there is always some there's points to this, in the sense that there's some point in doing it this way, not that way. And yeah, okay. So he's trying to understand what consciousness, in a sense, what consciousness is for, or why it is creating these constructions, the meaning it is giving to each of these things, right? In the case of someone like Heidegger, right, he would tend to think of all this in terms of projecting these things onto Dasein's own possibilities for action, when he would say that, we need our understanding of the chair over there because of the things you can do with the chair, like sit in it or throw it across the room, right? The practical things the practical actions that you might have with it, right, are the orienting things for Heidegger. Less so for Husserl, and this is why this theoretical orientation that Levinas is on about in chapter 7 comes out most in this chapter, right? The first is just the orientation of consciousness in its world, right? And the characteristic claim here is this is the what Levinas calls the idea that there's a doxic thesis in each of the intentional acts of consciousness. What does this mean? What is a doxic thesis? First of all, doxic just means opinion-like. There's some opinion about a state of affairs involved. And thesis, it means there's something like a truth claim about a reality. So what Husserl is saying is that in any of the intentional acts of consciousness, there's some guess or theory about what is the case that is ascribing, truth and being to something or other, right? The guess or theory about what is actually the case, ascribing some truth or being to something or other, is always there as part of the meaning of every intentional conscious act. So there's a trying to be true, a trying to be oriented in a true behind every conscious act to Husserl. And this matters to him because it's the in a sense the truth-seeking nature of consciousness, the truth-revealing nature of consciousness. You don't care about practically orienting on things which aren't there. You don't ascribe moral values or mood-altering values or love interests to non-existent things, right? There's the things have to be real for you in some manner or other for you to care about them. If Heidegger is going to say that care is the basic structure of Dasein, to Husserl, you first have to have enough being orientation that you think that the things you're reacting to are real, right? So in a sense, there's a doxic base in when I say doxic base in Husserl, there are it's not even that you're making truth claims in the sense that you would write them down as propositions. It's more like there's truth assumptions, right? There's some assumed way the world actually is behind any of the intentional objectifying acts. Okay. We need to talk about what he means by an intentional objectifying act here first, right? An objectifying act is an act that makes an object, right? What does he mean by an object? He means something that your thought can be thinking about. It's that abstract, it's that general, right? I'm trying to think about something. That means I have an object of my thought. An objectifying act is something which constitutes that object as something I can think about. And the claim is, whenever you are trying to think about something like that, it's because for some purpose or another, as fallibly as you like, there's something about you that is guessing, at least, that that's true. There is a guess about the truth or reality of the thing you're making the object of your thought. You don't try to think about things which just deceive you. You don't try to think about things which you regard as falsehoods, right? There's always a trying to be in the true aspect of intentional objectifying acts to Husserl. Okay. There are people later who will dispute this, but that's where Husserl is. The other curious thing here is, after he has claimed that, he will still tell you that if you want to do, if you want to understand phenomenological reduction in particular, and philosophical intuition, the best place to do it is by reasoning about fiction. Why? Right? It's in fiction that you'll see the parts of the relationships between intentional objects that you regard as most essential, right? You're thinking about the performances of characters in a novel, the actions of characters in a novel, right? All of them are going to be things that that are meaningful categories of action to you, right? You're not going to, all of them are going to be things that you could imagine translating to your own life world, or you wouldn't put them in the novel, right? The things that you're going to see as significant, relevant guideposts, categories in any fictional understanding are going to be ones which would translate to important understandings if quote real unquote. Okay. So yes, both things being claimed simultaneously. The first is that your thoughts about things are always trying to be true. They're always trying to orient you into a real world as opposed to a merely possible world. But also that you can tell the categories that matter to you most by the fact that they're still there in your fictional worlds, right? The guideposts that matter to you are still there in your fictional worlds. That's how you can tell that they're always going to matter to you, because they don't even depend upon the world that you're considering being non-fictional, right? Okay. Reactions to this?
Quick question.
Yes.
Quick question on that is he thinking about Jane Austen, or is he thinking about James Joyce?
I think Jane Austen. I think he's thinking about Jane Austen more than James Joyce. Yes, there are certainly
way to put it.
There are certainly versions of fiction that are all about trying to shatter this notion. I mean, even leave aside Joyce, even things like Proust, Husserl will admit that all of our understandings of memory can be false, but he'll also say that we're always effectively trying to have them be true. We're not trying to remember things that didn't happen to us because they're better than the things that did in Husserl, right? And there definitely are forms of fiction which are, kind of deliberately playing with this notion that that we care about the reality of the past that way. But in Husserl, naively, if you like, there is that truth orientation. But I particularly like this idea that there's something about fiction that itself has a truthful character. He says, fiction is the vital element of phenomenology as well as all the other eidetic sciences. Why? Because the ontological structure of the categorizations you have of things in fiction are going to be invariant between that fictional and your actual orientation in the world. The later philosophical thought, which is closest to this, is the possible worlds idea, right? It's the idea that you can use structure claims about possible worlds to tell which of your propositions you consider merely an inessential empirical variable, right? And which you consider a essential ontological bones of the world can't change. Go ahead, Joe. Joe's on mute.
So the arrow moves, and I didn't notice it. I like very much how he gave us a nice definition of object.
Yes.
And I had often heard decades ago with no reference or source that the nice thing about something that's objective is that you'd never know everything that's possible to know about it because it could rotate on you. Whereas if it's abstract, you can know everything about it. And I've always dismissed that. But I always wonder how much of this old wives' tales that I picked up 40 years ago have any validity. And I think I've found in what he presented there. Very nice. It fits right in. So I'm pleased. So his definition of object, however, definitely includes these things that would be in a scenario of fiction,
Yes.
don't you think?
Yes.
And so, and that's what makes it very interesting. Now, there are
And
people
to
in
be
this
clear,
field that,
sorry, slow down for a second. To be clear, I mean, he'll say things. He'll say something is material when he means that it has content, not that it's a piece of matter outside. And he'll say is an object when it's something thought about, not when he means, you know, extended exterior material particular, right? So there are plenty of other people for whom they're going to use object in a much more restricted sense than that, and they're going to use material in a much more restricted sense than that. And if a Lockean empiricist says material object, he means I can hit it with a stick and it's over there, right? Not what Husserl means. By object, he means you can think about it. And by material, he means the kinds of things you can think about it depend upon what kind of thing that it is. And it's not a purely logical form, right? So,
okay, so hit it with a stick becomes basically the reductio here for the material object that is nothing more than material object. Would that make such people who believe that that's the end of everything we're talking about, everything else is made up? Are those the people you would call objectivists, or would you reduce them, call them only materialists, or what would you do in labeling?
I would call them materialists. And the diagnosis that Husserl has, he calls them naturalists, but I mean, you could further restrict it from naturalist to materialist. But is that they want to take the kind of being that the material particulars have and use it as their standard for being as such, and regard anything which doesn't have being in exactly that same way as not actually being a being, right? So the naturalist materialist is someone who thinks the kind of existence that extended material particulars have is the standard for what counts as being or existence, and whatever isn't in exactly that same way isn't at all, right? Or is only an abstraction, or is only a set of words or whatever, all of which are ways of saying isn't really. And from Husserl's point of view, the reason for that is that one, those naturalists are just not looking at the other areas of being as the mind actually intends them. That's one. But second, they have that standard because the objects that they're talking about are the ones which are most readily given to perceptual intuition, right? The element of truth in what they're saying is that perceptual intuition is our best standard for how things can be immediately present to the mind, to consciousness, right? They want that same kind of immediacy of evidence of the material particular, the way that they perceive the material particular. Their perception of the material particular is setting their standard for what counts as seeming evident and as seeming true, right? And Husserl is willing to agree that that sense of the intuition you have of the material particular is a kind of standard that the mind has for what counts as evident and true, right? But then he's going to point out, if you watch how we do that, it's way more complicated than they think, right? And the material particulars that you're getting access to are way more complicated than your perceptions of them, right? The actual intended objects of that couch over there includes a whole bunch of way more nebulous things about my assumption that it's going to persist in time, that it was here before I entered the room, that it's got these other sides to it, right? That I could walk around it and it would still be the same thing. I have to synthesize a whole bunch of stuff in a time extended way and in a different varieties of experience and in a potential and actual way to get the actual couch that I'm meaning over there. And when I'm trying to talk about the material particular, I'm not trying to talk about the sense of gray I have over this portion of my visual field. I'm trying to talk about the actual transcendent thing over there, which has all those other characteristics I just laid out, right? So Husserl is agreeing that our intuition wants to set that kind of perceptual, organized, constructed thing as our standard of truth. That's the element of truth to Husserl in naturalist materialism. It's got a standard of truth from somewhere, and it's trying to look for that standard being met everywhere else. Its error is in thinking that standard of truth is just a kind of being, and that only that kind of being is real, right? It should be taking the standard of that kind of intuition as a standard of intuitive truth, but it should not be assuming that that kind of being is the only kind of being there is, because that kind of being is so narrow it can't even include mathematics, for example. It can't even include logic, right? Other things that the most scientific natural scientist wants to keep and have truth value, right, would go by the wayside if you took that too literally, which is what the fight over psychologism is showing. Okay, so does that help? Great. Okay, we talked a little bit about how Levinas is stressing throughout this whole of chapter 7 about how Husserl is focused on the theoretical. He's seeing the theoretical consciousness as being the paradigm of consciousness, the ability to, in a way, understand the environment around consciousness as just the material world or as the empirical world. That's kind of his paradigm. And even for the other things that you would contemplate, it's the theoretical contemplation of the truths about them, which is always the standard for Husserl. So from Levinas's point of view, and he thinks also from Heidegger's point of view, that is like an insane overprivileging of the theoretical attitude or of the theoretical consciousness. And that means fundamentally it's not necessarily an unmotivated consciousness. It's just that its motive is purely theoretical. Its motive is just to see what is, so to speak. And from Heidegger or Levinas's point of view, Husserl is supplying all of that focus and focused intention himself without being particularly justifying why. And there's a question about how much that captures the actual phenomenological evidence, so to speak. I would say that I'm much more sympathetic to Husserl on this point than that Heideggerian criticism. I think that Heidegger is right in a lot of the stuff he picks out as being ways in which the structure of the life world, so to speak, has all of this practical, motivated individual character. I think there's plenty of stuff of being in time there that's just sound. But what Husserl was trying to do in staying at the more theoretical level was in part to bring the scientists along, so to speak, to make sure that the logical, scientific, naturalist orientation saw value in the place where he was going. He was trying to stay low to the ground. He was trying to take the steps that can be most readily justified, right? And by the time you're flying off to, the basic structure of human existence is care, right? You know that Bertrand Russell is going to leave the building, right? He's not going to come with you, right? And all the Humean skeptics and all the Lockean empiricists and all the Russellian logic choppers are going to, see each of these steps as being arbitrary, forced, and unbelievable. They're going to say, "Are you making this up?" and not follow. And that's what Husserl was basically trying to avoid, right? He was trying to stick to claims that he could defend with sufficient rationality and evidence to convince such people, right? Because he was not trying to, strike out boldly on a direction where no one else was going to go in order to discover something. He was definitely trying to discover something new, but he was trying to bring the others along with him, so to speak. And there's plenty of later people in this tradition that, for whom that's not important to them at all. Basically, it's like, catch me if you can, keep up with me if you can, right? If only 6 people are convinced by the thing that I'm doing, so much the better. It'll be that much more exclusive a club that we're in, right? Is an attitude you get with a lot of sort of later philosophers here. And Husserl, has this much more, if I put it this way, staid academic and scientific sense that he's trying to make evident each step he makes, so that if someone isn't agreeing or following, it's only because they haven't read him with sufficient attention, or they haven't, they haven't really grasped it, which is certainly possible. But he doesn't want to be making claims that are so tendentious that easily half the world is going to dismiss them out of court, right? And I think it's fair to say that plenty of later continental philosophy after him kind of falls into that trap. It kind of just completely breaks with the Anglo-Saxon analytic tradition and just says, yeah, we don't really need to talk to those people. They're just wrong, right? We'll just keep going off in this direction, right? Which, to be fair, people on the other side are doing to them too, right? But it's not clear that it promotes, mutual understanding and dialogue for either side of this divide to have that attitude towards the other side of this divide. So to me, that's one of the things which is attractive about Husserl, is that he's trying to maintain the communication between these very different understandings of philosophy in a way that some of his successors just completely abandoned the attempt. Anyway, that's part of what to me comes out in this chapter 7 on philosophical intuition. It's Husserl is trying to explain his own activity in his own terms, and to do so in a way that would be acceptable to a Bertrand Russell, right? He's not trying to do so in a way that would be challenging and interesting to a Francois Lyotard, right? If that helps. Anyway, thoughts on that aspect of the philosophical intuition chapter, Craig? No? Okay. All right. The third thing we should probably get to is just this is our final session on Husserl, so we should just wrap up on general thoughts on Husserl and what we've learned here, right? If anything, right? I just gave you a few of my of those reactions on my own part, but I want to hear your guys just general reactions to reading Husserl. I realize this was new to most people here. It's usually the traditions after it that people know more, and lots of people just don't know the Husserl himself. In terms of predecessors, I think they're even less known, right? The Bergsons and so forth, even less known than the Heideggers. So if people know Husserl, it's primarily through the existentialism stuff that came after him, and just he's thought of as just a predecessor of that. But any reactions to just learning this much about Husserl himself? Joe?
Very, very pleased. I believe I mentioned when we began the book that Husserl, or my ignorance of Husserl, goes back to a mention, just a casual mention of the philosopher Husserl to a friend of mine back at the end of the early 1970s, I guess, end of 1960s. And I was so puzzled about that. I said, oh, he's one of those biggies, isn't he? And basically I said, yeah, I would recite them, Plato, Aristotle,
Yes.
And I'd missed most of them. And so I knew he was there, and I wondered about all these guys. Now, what did they contribute? Why were they remembered today?
Yep.
Anyway, so going forward, as we got into this, I was particularly focused, and knowing what my friend's career went on to become, the way in which representation became a sort of central point really kept catching my eye in this discussion, especially these last two chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Representation being the starting point of all action, and that fits immediately into the model my friend spent his life writing books and books about. So I'm interested now.
Right.
I've never read any of my friend's books. They're more technical than I could possibly even approach.
Right.
I looked at this first one. Fortunately, I didn't have to pay the $150 to get to glance at it. But it's one of those books that only sells for $300 or something now, and I'm sure but he's got a worldwide following. He goes to conferences in Australia and Europe. I don't have much contact with him, but I'm amazed. So I'm interested in Husserl and this representation idea. And now that I begin to get a better picture of how he views this phenomenological approach and eidetic knowledge and stuff, it makes a hell of a lot more sense.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
I like the brief introduction.
good. I mean, so glad we'll go into the reaction. I just want to talk a little bit about the representation thing for a second. So that there's a pre-version of this, not Husserl's notion of representation, but the fundamental, the basic contrast you get in the early 19th century is people like Schopenhauer, the world as will and as representation, where you have this notion of two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. One is this sort of Enlightenment rationalist, scientistic, where are the objects in space world of representation, which is basically coming out of Schopenhauer's understanding of Kant. And then there's over against this will or freedom or the ethical and aesthetic and everything like that, as well as the motivated or the motivational, right? And that sort of contrast of will versus representation kind of became the theoretical attitude versus the life world, motivated, practical, all those sorts of things, right? So that split or distinction goes back at least to reactions to Kant. It goes back to people like Fichte on one hand and people like Schopenhauer on the other. And on different sides of that divide, you can say Nietzsche comes out on the will side of that divide, for example, right? And someone like a Frege or a Wittgenstein comes out on the representation side of that divide. They're only trying to understand half of the world, so to speak. What you get in Husserl is for him representation. He's really putting the emphasis on the re part of that and reflection even more than representation. But the direct intuitions of things is a presentation to Husserl rather than a representation. And our evidence comes from the presentations, from the actual intuitions. And in that sense, representational knowledge is to him a lesser form of knowledge because it's the stuff which is like the syntactic, reasoning, putting together of things instead of going back to the direct presentation evidence. On the other side of it, when he's talking about the philosophical attitude, he's talking about reflection. And what he means by reflection is precisely that you're watching yourself thinking instead of just doing the thinking, right? So when you're just doing the thinking, it's all the, transcendent objects that concern you. And reflection is this, special lens thrown over all of that to watch yourself thinking as you're doing it. And that does, in a way, go back to the German idealists like Fichte. It goes back to Descartes in various ways, that kind of attitude. But Husserl has a particular reason in mind for doing that, which is just to see how the mind thinks, right? How consciousness constitutes objects, so to speak. There's an attitude, there's an element of this privileging of the theoretical attitude, which is a little bit like just harking on the world of representation. But for Husserl, representation and reflection, not quite the same thing. Reflection is what philosophical consciousness is about rather than representation. And in terms of intuitive knowledge, he's going to distinguish between representation and presentation. Presentation is having the whole object there. He likes to say, bodily there in front of you, right? As what intuitive knowledge is like. Whereas representative knowledge is more like only knowing things by what they signify, right? Knowing where they stand in a chain of reasoning, knowing them by their implications, so to speak, instead of by direct intuitive experience of them. Reactions to that?
Just a final closure. My friend made his career and his reputation in psychology,
okay,
and robotics as well
Gotcha.
as philosophy.
Got it.
So you see, I do see how these things come together.
Yep, fair enough. Certainly some of this stuff about, like regional ontologies, et cetera, had a definite afterlife in sort of computer science applications of, trying to organize knowledge, not only for human access, but for anything like automation of any reasoning about them. Okay, Craig, just reactions to the Husserl in general.
In general, I'm glad we went through it because it's kind of a piece that I missed in my formal training. We didn't get that far, put it simply. So it's good to pick this up, a little bit better understanding of the, I really want to put it without being too detrimental, the historical context of where Husserl fits into the
Yes.
whole realm of things. Very, to me, very, very critical. The I'm looking forward to getting a book back that I loaned out to a friend of mine on Jung and phenomenology,
Okay.
And exploring more what the followers have taken that into, because so much of what Jung is talking about is dream states and active imagination states, which are very different than what Husserl is alluding to,
Yes.
And trying to get at the reality of archetypes versus the reality of ideas is going to be an interesting challenge. The other one that it's helping me with is a little bit more of where it seems Nikolai Hartmann's coming from too.
Yep. Yep.
That's reacting to and following up on Husserl, not just taking a slightly different track from Heidegger, but who he has worked very closely with. But that also intrigues me to spend a little bit more time with that, the struggles that he's having with levels of ontology and such as that are making more sense to look at based on a little bit more of this foundational work. So it was a worthwhile read, even if I came away a little bit disappointed that we got left in the historical contingency to some extent.
Yes.
But worth doing from the standpoint of filling in a gap in my understanding.
It's fair to say that compared to someone like Jung, Husserl is definitely focused more on the fully conscious, so to speak, and this is also part of this like focus on the theoretical attitude. When he'll tell you that it is essential to the nature of lived experience that it is conscious, right? This is not a proposition that Jung would sign off on. But I'm reminded of
you would say you have to bring the unconscious up to the conscious, though.
Well, right. So this is giving me the next point I was going to get to. I said there's a wonderful passage in Stanley Rosen. I forget where it occurs, but it might be in the limits analysis, might be in the looseness of the ordinary. But anyway, it's one of these places where he's talking about some of these issues, and he's bringing up the different both the structuralists and psychologists who are, as he tries to put it, something like they practice divination of the unconscious. He calls it divination, right? So they're going to interpret the unconscious for us, right? And so he gives a sort of gloss on what they're typically doing, and then he has a little reaction to all of it. He says, for all attempts of this kind, right, it is necessary to point out, says Rosen, that the unconscious is unconscious and will remain so. Right. So the thing that you find in Husserl is this attempt to hew closely to the evidence. And what you get in a lot of the other psychologies, especially the psychologies of the unconscious, is that they're perfectly willing to adopt what I can call the characteristic naturalist attitude of, I really want to know how it works inside, and I'm allowed to just make inspired guesses about how it could work. And if they match the phenomena that comes out the other side, I can treat that as confirmation of my guess. And for scientific theories, absolutely, you can do that, right? And it's a characteristic thing that people do, and Jung is definitely doing it, right? He's got a theory about how it could work inside, and he's going to make a guess that he thinks is an inspired guess. And if it ticks off explanations for a bunch of phenomena that were otherwise mysterious as a result, he's going to say, okay, then my guess was good, right? It's holding up so far, right? It's giving me useful signposts for predicting things which otherwise seem completely unpredictable or incomprehensible to me, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing that Husserl doesn't try to do, right? He wants to have immediate intuitive evidence of something, like he has between one step and another of a math problem, and not because he's a logic chopper, but because he's for him, being a phenomenologist means staying close enough to the immediate evidence that he can just show it to you, right? He can just point to it. Yes, you're going to have to go look at it yourself. It's not going to be the kind of thing where the logic or the language itself is going to compel assent, so to speak. but he can point you at the thing, and if you go do the experiment or go have the thought that he pointed out to you, you can verify for yourself that it is so, right? And you don't find that in Jung. You don't find that in Heidegger, honestly, right? Who's also willing to take much longer steps, so to speak. Husserl is definitely this a methodical guy in this other sense of trying to stay low enough to the ground that he can give you the evidence for each proposition as he advances it. Does he always succeed in that? I don't think he always succeeds in that. He's always trying to do that, but he's not always succeeding in doing that. Sometimes he's thinking so deeply into his own scheme that you can't tell which piece of his scheme he's referring to in one section or another, right? It's like, if you just go look at the thing, says, well, I would love to go look at the thing. Which of these 6 things are you talking about, right? So he sometimes overrates how comprehensible his own schematisms are. In that sense, manages to be less evident than he's trying to be. But yeah, that's a definite difference between them, and fundamentally in that respect, as odd as it may sound, Jung is more of the scientist, but also more of the Platonist, who thinks that he can just guess how the machinery works behind the scenes, and as long as it matches with the phenomena come out on the other side, it's going to count as a confirmed guess.
Yeah. So the other area that that kind of keeps gnawing at me a little bit is evidence from Husserl seems to be the evidence that we can grasp. But we have a finite body with a finite amount of wavelengths that we can see with our eyes, a lot of other finitudes that in many respects the growth in the last 100 years has been, for lack of a better word, instrumentationalism, or finding instruments that can help us see things that we wouldn't normally have.
Sure.
And scientifically, we call that evidence. So in many respects, a lot of our sense of realities that we now adhere to are not just thought experiments, but are actual experiments where the translation of that wavelength into something we can experience is brought to us.
Right, and to be fair, I mean, so you're right that he's focused on what can be made evident to us unassisted, so to speak. He does when he's talking about philosophical intuition and some of the other, and even eidetic intuition, he does talk about these cases where you can develop a direct formal intuition of something that you wouldn't understand at all outside of a larger thought structure. His paradigm cases for all these things is mathematics, right? And higher mathematics, right? I mean, if I tell you that you need to verify by your direct intuition some fact about the conformal boundary of an anti-de Sitter space, right? You're going to have to go through a heck of a lot of construction and following chains of reasoning to even see the object I'm talking about, right? And to be able to see something like what the heck do you mean by a conformal boundary? And you've got a little picture in your head of like a hyperbolic, disk with things getting smaller towards the edges and so forth. And you're going to have to use that to, develop an intuition of it. And he talks about how, you use particular instances which aren't of the full thing itself, but are close to it to do that. He does think you can have intuition of those things, that you can have eidetic intuition, so to speak, that's informed by those, chains of construction and categories, and that you wouldn't have any immediate experience of, right? It's not like there's you have access to an anti-de Sitter space inside your cortex that you can go look things up with. You have to use other things which are, ways of seeing something like that, right? But he does think that that's possible, that you can train intuition to see things that it wouldn't have seen before in towers of eidetic extraction. And math examples are his examples for this. But math examples more than perceptual examples, and elaborate constructions more than instrumentation, right? But
so is it more a mathematical representation of an electron as opposed to the instrumentational evidence of an electron that makes the electron real?
I think that for Husserl, yes, right. I mean, I think that for Husserl, the real electron is much more about the its place in standard model theory, right, than it is, you know, the deflection of a needle on some, you know, detector, right? Yeah, and he's more of the mathematician and more the theoretician and less of the experimentalist in that regard. Absolutely. And in this respect, this is why he's, you know, he's way more of a rationalist than he is an empiricist on this point. Fair point.
Yeah, and that's I realize still part of the historical contingency to some extent too. He was doing what he needed to do for his age and his.
Yeah, but I mean, I also think that's just that's a fundamental temperamental difference across time and philosophers, and you know, I'm definitely in his camp in that regard. You know,
Yeah.
Without question, and for the same reason that I'm more Platonist than Aristotelian, right? You know, so you know, it's you know, and I switched from a physics major to a math major within one semester of college, right? You know, so it's a temperamental thing, right?
Yeah, I got through physics because I could do the math, and
Right.
still struggled with the phenomenology. You know,
Yeah.
but I managed both degrees just barely.
Yeah.
But as I got into graduate school, I came to realize it was more about the ability to do the math than the ability to see, to have the physical insight.
Yeah.
And that really.
You just described my computer science course. I thought it would be programming every day, and what it turned out to be is just math upon math upon more math.
Yes. Theoretical computer science is a foundations of math subject matter. There's no question, right? You know, a Turing machine is a tuple that takes, you know, these things and maps into this space, right? Okay. Any
along with what I said, I wrote it in the chat. Basically, I remember somebody saying, I don't know who, that the scientists keep finding more particles because they keep looking. Like, of course, I don't know how to explain it for it to make sense, but like, of course, it's working. The universe works because of the particles. But
well, I mean, to be fair, I mean that mostly they only see particles that they're looking for, and the reason they're looking for them is they fit in a theory, right? And they certainly did back in the earlier days of particle physics see lots of things that they didn't have the slightest reason for thinking existed, right? Back in the 50s and 60s, they're doing particle experiments. They, you know, the famous line is like, you know, who ordered that? You know, they see all these, what we now know as mesons of various kinds running around doing things that, you know, made no sense to them from what their theories then were, right? But we've passed that pretty much. I mean, by the 1970s, everything that they're looking for, onward, everything they were looking for was something that they had reason to believe from a theory they would find, right? And they were working harder and harder to, you know, get to the energies to be able to see it and have, you know, have enough events to be able to, you know, see it with a certain statistical confidence or whatever. And there would be some mass that they needed to calculate, you know, as a result of what the experiments told them, because it was left free by the theory or something like that. And sometimes they'd, you know, discover, you know, they could rule out, you know, some other theory that was, you know, farther along, right? But there was definitely a period there where they had way more things than they could explain that they needed a theory to explain. But, you know, since standard model, you know, it's more the other way around now. And that's not to say that there aren't places where there are experimental things happening, which, you know, tell them there's got to be some new physics here. There certainly are in cosmology, for example. But it tends to be more in the cosmology side of things than in the particle physics side of things. Most of the things they've been finding for 40 years now in particle physics have been things that they were looking for because they made some theory more symmetric, right? Or, you know, it was something that was already predicted. As long as our theory of how these field effects are working, and there should be another one of these up at this larger mass that we haven't been able to get to yet, right? And every time that
Yeah,
happens and they find it, they're like, okay, that theory's got to be sound.
And then they're getting to the point when you really start dwelling into quantum field theory that there are no particles. There's only field interactions.
Sure.
Which they
A particle is, yes, a particle
is a
is
field interaction.
Yeah, it's an invariant in a field. Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
It's some persistent property of a field. This reminds me, there was a Poincaré around, turn of the 19th to 20th century was trying to explain, says that the naive person outside of science thinks that, you've discovered all these fundamental conservation laws, and these are, amazing discoveries. And he says, but they don't seem to realize that, in any theory, there'll be so and so many integral relations described, and every one of those integral relations will have some constant of integration which is left free by the theory, and every single one of those will be some conserved quantity in the resulting, phenomenology. So, if any of my explanations of natural laws have integral signs in them, then I have to have conserved quantities. And this is it's purely a side effect of the math, right? And that was like the attitude he had in, the 1890s before people found any of this crazy stuff. But anyway, there's all kinds of ways in which the math and consistency of the math drives a whole bunch of this. But that doesn't mean it's the only story. It does mean that as in Husserlian terms, our reasoning about the eidetic level tells us all kinds of things that we, find have to be true, something like that. Which doesn't mean that our eidetic level theories can't change.
What Craig was just talking about, the later steps in field theory, that there is no particles. Is that to say that there is no pen, there's just lines, like the places where the pen has drawn, and the pen itself is just, like, I don't know. I'm trying to understand what he was trying to say.
So the point about particles is just that, in the actual full field theory understanding, a particle itself is just a set of characteristics of certain invariants of the field, certain things which are conserved quantities of the field, and they're not localized, right? So why would we call them particles, right? Originally, what we meant by particle was that it was some material-like thing that was at this particular point in space. But the things which we actually call quantum particles aren't at one point in space, and they don't look like matter. They look like a set of conserved quantities in a weirdly fluctuating half of a chance of something, right? What the heck is that? Mathematically it makes perfect sense, but the relation of it to a particle is just that, yes, if you zoom out far enough, when these things interact with each other, they will behave like particles, right? In the sense that they won't have any interaction at these long distances, and then they will start having an interaction at this short distance, and something will be conserved in that interaction. These are those ways, or these are those energies. But fundamentally, those are field configurations to the people who are going down inside the smallest pieces of them. Anyway,
one of my friends asked me to describe it once, and we were sitting in a place that had a tablecloth, and so I looked down at the tablecloth. I said field, and then I twisted part of the tablecloth till it made a little peak in the field, and I said particle.
Yes. Yes. So another there's a wonderful perspective on that you get from various kinds of experimentation on abstract dynamical systems, like in computer stuff, right? And what one of them is if anything has a periodic background, right? And you just introduce a defect in it that propagates, you can treat that defect in the periodic background as a particle. A slight defect in an otherwise perfectly uniform alternating checkerboard, for example, right, acts like a particle, right? So anything which is conserved in evolution and it is distinguishable from from a background which is otherwise flat, uniform, or periodic will count as a particle in any of those dynamical systems. So what particle likeness is something like conserved discernible defect. Where by defect we just mean deviation from an otherwise simple uniformity.
Yeah, that makes sense actually.
Okay. Well, I want to talk quickly about what we plan to do next time, and this is mostly because some people previously had said they wanted to do this, and we skipped over it to do this to do the Husserl, in part because we wanted to know more about the foundations of existentialism. The general topic in which we're going at is what are the foundations of existentialism? We did all this Heidegger stuff and Heidegger and Nietzsche stuff, and lots of people are interested in sort of where are the bodies buried at the origins of existentialism, right, so to speak. And one of them is phenomenology and this how something broke off of previous German idealism and spawned this whole method that turned into being in time, right? That's one of the things we got from this Husserl thing. The other place that we had origins of this is Kierkegaard. So that's the thing we were going to do next. So we had talked about doing particularly the essay, The Sickness Unto Death, which is despair. And this is, so this is a full century earlier, well, almost a full century earlier. And it's the philosophy behind it is kind of Hegel, but he's a critic of Hegel, obviously, in ways which it may echo some aspects of later existentialism. He's also a Christian thinker, so this is theological in many ways, but it's also psychological. So it's a philosophical, psychological, and religious at the same time work about despair. Where the philosophy behind it is kind of a Hegelian structure that Kierkegaard himself doesn't entirely agree with, by which I mean Kierkegaard does agree with the structure, but he's not a Hegelian, right? The Hegel and Fichte-like philosophy that this structure comes from is not simply his own philosophical understanding. What am I talking about there? He has a notion of what it means to be a self, and you should pay attention to what self means. Spirit and self. Anyway, but what is this also related to? We saw that one of the criticisms that Levinas had of Husserl was that it was too theoretical and not practical enough. And one of the criticisms that he had even of Heidegger was that it was too practical. It wasn't ethical enough in Levinas's case. So if you had a focus on the structures of the life world or psychology, for which the moral and the spiritual was more important than the purely theoretical or purely ideal-like, then you would get Kierkegaard, right? His fundamental question is not how you know something, but more like how you're living, right? And this focus of how you're living and what it means aspect is characteristic of a lot of existentialism. It's sort of a move to the practical in a wide sense, but also to the ethical at least in Levinas and Kierkegaard. And there's a kind of implicit criticism here that we saw back in the book on Being and Some Philosophers, where Kierkegaard comes in as a big critic of Hegel. Hegel has this entire rationalistic system that's going to understand the world, and but there's not going to be any room left in it from Kierkegaard's point of view for what Kierkegaard would regard as critical ethical action, something like that. Kierkegaard is also famous for the notion of the subjective truth. The subjective truth is the thing which isn't true unless you're experiencing it directly yourself, right? Is it true that you're in love with someone? Well, if you don't feel like you're in love with someone, then you aren't. There are certain things that you, it's not enough that they be true in some abstract sense. If you don't know them, they don't exist. And know them subjectively, right? So he and Kierkegaard is famously a critic of Hegel as not having sufficient room for such phenomena in his system. He'll claim that he does. He'll claim that he has reconciled everything subjective and everything objective and ticketed and sorted where all of them stand. But from Kierkegaard's point of view, the subjective in Hegel is fake because it is too rational. It's been overly rationalized to the point of being fake. Anyway, that's just a little bit of background on Kierkegaard and why we would care. It is also fair to say that this is a determinately Christian work, not just a religious work, but a determinately Christian work. And you have to see what role that actually plays for him, and what how to put it, how much Christianity there is in it, and how much it is Kierkegaard speaking for something, right? Is this Christ's religion or Kierkegaard's religion? Is a way of putting it, right? And is Kierkegaard's religion how independent of Hegelian understanding of self or spirit is it actually? Because it purports to be this authentically original Christian thing, but it might be something that's more derivative from Hegel than it lets on. Anyway, that's just some thoughts to have in mind as you're reading it. To me, the single most interesting thing here, well, there's lots of interesting things here, but one of the most interesting things here is just the dialectical analysis of despair. When I say dialectical, I mean the many forms of despair. And there are elements in which he's going through the different forms of despair that remind in some ways of the analysis of care and inauthenticity, both of them in being in time. I think it's fair to say that Heidegger was influenced by this, if nothing else. Okay, that's just some preface things of Kierkegaard. The one thing I really want to know from people is 2 weeks enough for the next one on this, or do we want 3? So Joe is saying 2.
2, yeah, 2.
Craig, do you have a thought?
Two is always enough, because if you choose to put in the time. Now, if you have a job, that's different.
Craig, thoughts on 2 versus 3?
I'll manage 2. I just joined another meetup group that is going through Peter Kingsley's Catafalque, so I got my reading cut out for me anyway.
Gotcha. Okay, so we next have to talk about how much of this book to do, right? So it has 2 parts, right? There's a whole preface introduction, which is like, I don't know, 8 pages. We don't want to read the actual, well, yeah, I don't think well, there's a question of how much of the introduction to read. I think we should start after the introduction. We should skip the introduction and go straight to part 1. Well, that would be page 35, where it's Kierkegaard himself speaking. Actually, we could potentially start even after that. Well, people might want to read the introduction. But the question is how far we can get. So can we do all this in 2 sessions? Maybe, but it might be challenging to try to do all of it in 2 sessions.
I don't have it in front of me, so divide that by page dozens or something.
Right. So the answer is that the whole thing goes from, in these little Penguin editions, 123 pages, the whole thing. And if we dare to do the whole first part, it would be on the order of, it'd be over 60 pages of relatively dense stuff.
I'm reluctant to
70
do.
pages.
Yeah, I'd like to trim 60, but I don't know if it's logically possible to trim 60.
It is. I mean, it's
but
just,
you know, it is.
there's two sides to this to realize, right? One is you get to do less if we trim 60. The other is you have to do it for over 4 sessions if we do it in halves of 60. And if you leave it at 60 or 70 pages each time, there's only going to be 2 sessions on this book.
Well, quantity of sessions doesn't faze me. So that stretches out to 8 to 12 weeks, 8 weeks, I assume. That's fine with me. My life allows it. But
Well, I will.
if the book became slow or dull, I might advocate doing it in bigger chunks.
That's partly what I'm thinking of. We had talked about possibly doing the higher ground primarities after this. I don't know if we would, but so my inclination is to do this in 2 sessions. Is to do just all of part 1 and then all of part 2.
I could rush through 2 sessions. I could,
okay.
But I emphasize that I would not be digesting it with the intensity I tried to focus on Husserl. But yeah, so tell us the break points.
Okay, so it's part 1, which is the sickness unto death is despair, and part 2, which is despair is sin, over 2 sessions. So the first one would be the sickness unto death is despair by April 4th. It's 60 to 70 pages. All right. I don't. Without objection, it is so ordered, as they say in parliamentary procedure. All right. I will put that up. I will also when this thing finishes, the recording and so forth, I'll put it up on YouTube for those who want it, and we'll plan on seeing you guys next time on the 4th, same time for the Kierkegaard.
Real quick, I just wanted to ask:
Sure.
Is this whole idea of the essence any different to the ship of Theseus? I mean,
to the what? Sorry.
It just seems like the ship of Theseus, where they had a ship and they keep changing all the parts, and it's a different ship, or is it not a different? I mean, it's basically the same idea, no? Just revisited.
Partly, but the fundamental idea of essence is that it's not a matter of parts. The essence of the ship would be, something like the ship shape and the fact that the ship shape can sail, right? That would be the essential part of it. So
that's the idea, right? Like, if you change all the parts of the ship, is it still Theseus' ship, right? It's kind of this whole idea of essence, like.
Well, the core idea of essence is just that there are those things which have to be true about something or remain properties of that something for it to remain the same thing, right? And what the ship changing its material parts is trying to do is just to show that the matter isn't essential in that case, right?
So it's the same idea, just revisited by later type of
it's not quite the same idea. The idea of the ship example is just to deny that the material components are essential to the ship, right? It's making a particular point about that particular essence, that matter isn't essential to it, right? Okay. But that's all, right? And the reason it's doing that is because there are some thinkers who will naively think that the thing of which the something is made is part of its essence. The bronze statue, if it were made out of rock, wouldn't be, a bronze statue, right? But does it have to be this bronze? No, right? So That's all that's being got at there. I think the idea of essence is itself a more fundamental idea. It's a more base level idea than that example.
Okay.
Fair question, Joe.
Well, I like how you answered his question, but it reminds me that I was struck in the face by the word quiddity, and it
Yes.
said the essence and the quiddity, and I suddenly said, "Oh my heavens! I need to look up quiddity. I don't have time."
Yes.
I'm asking you to save me the time.
Right. Quiddity just means the whatness of something, right? So it's what it is, right? And the point he makes about essence and quiddity is that there could be aspects of the whatness which are accidental, but they're still part of the whatness, right? So not every element of the whatness is part of the essence. When we say the essence, we're talking about something like a proper subset of the whatness of something that is the minimal necessary properties of that thing.
So if I were pruning a bush and I chopped off all of the upper and left only the root and the first stem, so I knew it would grow back, I'd retained its quiddity, but what had happened to its essence?
You would actually have gotten rid of much of its quiddity, right? You would have the quiddity before the quiddity after would be very different, right? But yeah. But for example, if part of the quiddity beforehand was the mass of the bush, you definitely changed that, right?
Okay, so
the point is that you change the mass, you change the spatial extent, etc. Right? Did you change the essence of the bush? It's possible that the essence of the bush is only down in the DNA that can remake the bush, right? But maybe not, right? It depends. There could be different contexts in which different of its attributes would count as the essential attributes for it. If the reason you have the bush is because the requirements of your homeowners association is that you have a certain number of bushes in your front yard, and they have a certain size requirement, and you reduce it below that that level, and you get fined for not having a bush in your front yard, then you might think that it's essential that it be large enough that the person who walks by does not fine you, right? So I'm just saying there could be things for which in different purpose contexts, one or another property of it could be essential, right? If all you're asking is, can I grow another, then maybe it's just the DNA pattern. But if it's can I grow another in some practical sense, if you just keep a little piece of its DNA on a slide on ice, it might not be enough to ever actually remake that. You get the point. So what is the essential about it? It could vary from the context, but it certainly is the case that there's going to be plenty of other things about it that you could change about it, and you would not change the essence of it. My favorite example of this is just I do this, right? I know that I'm a very robust thing because when I do this, I not become a different person. And this is already sufficient to scramble every very subtle field in my head. So I know I am not a subtle quantum mechanical entanglement thing because I am robust to small taps on the head, right? So I must be something more robust than that, right? So you get the point. There's always going to be some things about the actual full quiddity of a subject or of an object of your thought that you could change that are not essential to it, right? We are very rarely thinking about something so delicate that every single thing about it must be exactly the same for it to be that thing. And this is a general point that Husserl was making. The intentional objects of our thoughts are always these robust sets. They're never these tiny, gossamer, every detail matters, or I'm talking about something else thing, right? We don't think about the things which are so fully ramified and delicate that if you put one hair out of place, it would count as a different thing, right? We just couldn't reason about them.
This seems to be very, what's coming up for me is clear back in 1979 when I was finishing my thesis, I went over to a chemistry seminar and heard Ilya Prigogine talk. And, and he talked about non-equilibrium and the
Yes.
fact that we as human beings are non-equilibrium. We exchange all of our matter in a
Sure.
over certain cycles of time. We grow, we evolve, and he says the only time we reach equilibrium is when we're dead.
Yes.
At which point, then different processes take over from the externals to
Yes.
dissolve us. But I think that's part of the essence of the aspect. There is, who am I over these 70 years now of matter exchanges, being in an open, non-equilibrium environment in which I am able to survive, which is necessary for me to continue to thrive.
Yes.
Brings up a whole range of issues to talk about.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Prigogine was a physicist famous for non-equilibrium thermodynamics as his subject matter, you know, in equilibrium thermodynamics, you can treat everything as, you know, being fully characterized by a temperature and you know, a few other things about its components, but mostly it just has a temperature, right? But temperature, volume, you know, et cetera. The point is that without studying the full dynamics of things, he would study things in terms of thermodynamic properties. But non-equilibrium was, the whole point is, we always care most about the information or negative entropy of things, the lack of the opposite of the entropy of things, and all the interesting stuff happens on the transient, so to speak. That's the fundamental idea of the. By on the transient, I mean that something which is not a stable state that will last forever, but is a temporary aspect of the ongoing evolution of things. That's where all the actual interest happens. And in the case of us, you know, life, right, itself is a transient, so to speak. But this is just a physics perspective on some of these things. But yeah, he's a fun physicist.
We're still talking about ourselves in an essential way.
Yes, and this was, you know, that's a particular angle on what later became sort of complexity theory generally from the thermodynamic angle, because thermodynamics is a place where enough randomness results in order, something like that. And there were lots of people who were trying to understand complexity that way. And Prigogine's kind of point was, well, you know, enough randomness results in some very interesting things before it results in order.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
But the example in that sense is we look at ourselves as an essential, as the essence of who we are, as a particular human being, and yet when you take a different perspective on it, we are only a part of a non-equilibrium system of
yes,
an environment around which.
The part of that I'm going to object to is the word only. Right? We may also be that, but we're not only that, right?
Yeah.
But
yes, that's the important piece too.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is the Husserlian point on this, right? Which is that the idea that that you can slip in that only and it won't make a difference is the idea that we can take the being of us as physical and treat it as the being as such, and that's exactly what Husserl says you can't do, because that's the naturalist problem. Is they only see the notion of being or the version of being that they're focused on, and they think that the ones that they're just not looking at therefore don't exist, but they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the reason for the distinction.
Yeah. Okay, great, good stuff. So we'll see everybody next time for Kierkegaard, and hopefully some of our regulars come back. I know that Jim is interested in this topic, and I think Gabriel probably will be too. So maybe get a few other regulars back for the Kierkegaard, and it's going to be for April the 4th. All right, see you guys.